Welcome to The Big Picture, a show that takes a deep dive into the political landscape of not only America, but right here in our own backyard of Illinois. Folks, The Big Picture is on WCPT 820. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath.
I am not Edwin, but I'm glad to be sitting in for him today from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock, just after the 1 o'clock hour now till 4 p.m. I'm John St. Augustine. You may have recognized my name and voice. I've been on CPT quite a few times over the years, and always a kick for me to come in and sit into a live studio with my brother Paul sitting here on the other side. Thank you, sir. And we've worked together quite a few times, so it should go pretty smooth. I have to tell you, I have 30 years in radio, and a lot of that's been live on a lot of different stations here in Chicago, across the board, CBS, you name it, I've done it. And whenever I come here to WCPT, I have to come from the western suburbs in. I take the Eisenhower, and I get off and kind of wrangle my way through and find Milwaukee Avenue. And the studio is not far from a bar that I used to go to all the time. A little bit of a surreal experience. I used to throw people out of the bar 4 blocks, not even 3 blocks from here. I could tell you stories, man, all day, but we're not going to get into all that. But I want to tell you that it is really an interesting opportunity for me to come in. I spend most of my time these days either doing my own podcast with Life 2.0 podcast on Saturday mornings, which I already aired earlier today, or I'm building out podcasts for companies and businesses and authors and those like people as a business card in some sense. So it's become a really interesting, somewhat lucrative career late in my other career that I never expected, along with writing books and being a ghostwriter and a lot of other stuff that keeps me busy. So when I get the call to come into WCPT, I always try to make time to do that. So I'm glad you're with us for the next couple of 3 hours. I have a lot of ground to cover today. A little bit different than what Edwin would cover. Is not a deep dive into politics, even though we have some of that. But I try to maintain, as Hal mentioned earlier, some sense of perspective on all that's going on. If you've heard me on this channel before, and if you haven't, I'll just give you a little heads up here. Basically, what you're getting, even though it's been a long time since our 26th president's been in office, you're basically getting a 21st century imposter of Theodore Roosevelt. His life and his way of seeing the world has been the main driver in so much what I've done over the years, especially environmentally and taking the bully pulpit and calling things out and getting things done. He was a Republican, but now he'd be considered a tree-hugging liberal, I think, by whatever is going on in the current political landscape. So I want you to know where I come from on a lot of this stuff. Common sense for uncommon times is really the thing that is behind everything that I do. And conversation is really, really important. But having conversation with people who, aren't aware of the facts or don't care about science, I don't really do that much anymore. That's just a waste of time. If you're arguing with idiots, you get 2 idiots at some point, because there's no way to bring people up to a level if they're not willing to do that. So what I have lined up for you today, I think has different voices echoing some of the things that I think are important to look at. But before we get to all that, I want to tell you that obviously tomorrow is Super Bowl Sunday. And before we get to the serious stuff around 2 o'clock, I have an interview that I did with one of the very few guys that is left over from Super Bowls 1 and 2. Green Bay Packer Hall of Famer Jerry Kramer. We've been friends 4 decades. And while I am a vaunted and highly devout Chicago Bears fan, I'm also a Kramer fan. The interview you're going to hear, I had to pre-tape it because at 89 years old, Jerry Kramer, instead of being home getting ready to watch the Super Bowl, is out signing autographs in Wisconsin somewhere today. I could not pin him down, so we had to tape this, and there's bits and pieces from other things we've done. But I thought perspective is everything in life, and when you see how the Super Bowl is now compared to how it was in 1967, 68, in those early years, it's amazing what happens. There's a story that's not in this interview that I'll just share real quick before I jump into a couple other things. The ticket prices at Super Bowl I were $12. And Kramer got a deal on tickets. He needed 5 tickets, and he got them for $10. So he spent $50 to get 5 tickets for his family members who live out. This game was in L.A. at the Coliseum. And he waited fully dressed for the game at the front gate. Can you imagine this? There's a player in the game waiting at the front gate, fully dressed in his Green Bay Packers number 64 uniform. As people are walking into the stadium, he's waiting for his family to show up. None of them show up on time, so he gives 5 tickets to kids standing outside on their bikes for free. That would never happen these days. So it's those type of things when I talk with Kramer over the years, some of the many conversations we've had, that shows me how things change, not just obviously politically, but in our society. There's no way that anybody who played in Super Bowl I and maybe even Super Bowl II would know how this has all turned out. I don't even watch the halftime show anymore. I'm more interested in the commercials and the football game itself. So at the bottom of the hour, we're going to run this interview that I have with Jerry, and I just think it's a great perspective piece. And once that's done, at 2 o'clock, I'm going to be talking with Father John Pawlikowski, the professor emeritus of social ethics at the Catholic Theological Union. Try to say that in one breath. I just did. And he is part of the World Religions Conference on the Environment. And if there's one thing, actually there's two things that I really beat the drum when I'm here about is environmental things and veterans issues. And I'll get to that a little bit later. So Father John is going to talk to this John about the spiritual aspect and what is our responsibility to take care of the planet, and in doing so, take care of ourselves and clean up our messes. So as the current administration is getting ready to gut the EPA, what do we do in response to that? So there's so much going on now. There's so much information that you really can't do anything about except get ticked off. And if you get ticked off constantly, you kind of roll into PTSD. And I think at this point, on some level, everybody in this country, if not the world, has some level of post-traumatic stress disorder because you can't pound on people constantly and give them no recourse. It's very hard on the human central nervous system. So this is across the board, whether you're Democrat, Republican, independent, man, woman, doesn't matter. We all have the basic same central nervous system. Our connection points are different, that's for sure, but the wiring's basically the same. And if you feel put upon constantly and no way to really respond to things, it'll put you in a corner. And that is not where action is needed, is you stuck in a corner. So part of what I'm talking about today is finding the things that you can do where you are with what you have and do that, no matter what's going on in the White House. I say this all the time. What's going on in the White House is important. Don't ignore it one way or the other. But what's going on in your house should not be overlooked in lieu of these things, that the headlines are not nearly important as the lifelines. And when you start switching your perspective back, pretty soon you start to be able to ride these things out no matter what's going on. So that'll be coming up at 2 o'clock, Father John. No, Dr. John, that was a rock group, I think. Dr. Hook, sorry. I was listening to him on the way in here. At 2:30, I'm really excited for this. This is an old friend of mine. The former governor of New Jersey, Todd Whitman, will be joining me. She's calling in live today, and she is a devout Republican as we know it in the old school Republican way. Somebody I fall in lockstep with a lot of how she sees things. She was the EPA chief under George W. Bush, and she's got a lot to say. And I thought this would be the perfect forum to say it. This is a progressive talk station. And in so many ways, in my observation, experience, and opinion, the people who are on the Democratic side of things and the people who are more moderate Republicans can find some common ground. There's a lot of energy there, a lot of force there. And I'm all about that. You know, look, it's difficult, no question, to find the greater good sometimes in all that's going on. But we must do that in order to make life worth living, in my opinion. And so whatever's going on out there, know that it affects you in here somewhere, especially where you live. So when I'm talking with Governor Whitman, we're going to talk about some of the things that she's learned over the years and how this political stuff works. I'm telling you what. When you're the EPA chief under George W. Bush and the heat that came down in that administration looks like going on vacation these days. So she knows things from the inside out that none of us would know. We're all speculating, and we talk in theory. She talks in the realities of it. So she'll be on with me at 2:30. At 3 o'clock. Man, this one's a barn burner for me. I served in the Coast Guard from 1980 to 84 regular duty, enlisted, and then I was in 2 years in reserves. And most of the time, I did a couple temporary duty assignments here and there, but most of the time I was based right here in Glenview at NAS Glenview, Naval Air Station Glenview, that no longer exists. It was decommissioned, I believe, in 1995. And over the years, you know, there has been some attempts to restore and remember and remind people of what took place there. NAS Glenview is historic, especially during World War II. They literally had aircraft carrier trainings out on Lake Michigan from Chicago because of what was going on in the Pacific. And when you look at the list of the aviators that have gone through NAS Glenview, some serious heavy hitters in there. And so I was stationed there, and some of the best years of my life, some of it I can't even talk about. This is before I was doing all the bouncing at the bar. But some of the best years of my life was with some of the best men and women I know and served with. And when it was all said and done, the village of Glenview got the entire air base for $10. Since that time, of course, if you live out that way, if you ever drive through that area where the Glen is, they've done pretty well with it over the last few decades. And so it's a little disconcerting to me about why there's a disconnect, and some people seem to be a little adverse to telling that history. So I'm going to be joined by Kirsten Bergin from the Glenview Hangar 1 Foundation, and they have had a museum in a small little building outside of the former bounds of the air base, and they have a lot of artifacts in there from the many decades that the Glenview Air Base was online, and all the Navy, Air Force, Marines, Army, Coast Guard that was going on there. And in particular, I have a very personal reason for being so steeped in this, is that there is a helicopter, a Sikorsky HH-52A 1459, sitting in a parking lot outside the base boundary, is part of this museum. It's under a shrink wrap, which some of my Coast Guard crewmen and I got done, and the museum put up some money. We got the thing shrink wrapped, but it used to sit hanging from the top of the rafters at the Museum of Science and Industry for a very long time. And in 2006, there was a lot of movement going on about having a museum in Glenview, and the helo got shipped out there, and it's been sitting ever since. So those of us who spent time around that helo or in that helicopter, pilots, crew members, mechanics, you name it, we all have attachment to that. And so Kristen's going to join me. We're going to talk about the efforts they've had over the years and some of the things that she has found very difficult to overcome. And the matter of the fact is that they're on their last legs over there. They're in a very small, temporary, month-to-month space. They're looking now, if they don't get funding somehow or a place to move this, that they're going to have to just disperse all the artifacts, find homes for this stuff, and it will be as if it never was. That doesn't sit real well with me. So when I found out I was going to be on today, I said, Kirsten, let's have a conversation. So in all full disclosure, which I will repeat when she's on at 3:00, I was at a board meeting, and there's something about board meetings, B-O-A-R-D, and then there's board meetings, B-O-R-E-D. So I was there for something, just to talk for 3 minutes on what I thought was important with this helicopter in the museum. And it was difficult to sit through, but I learned a lot about zoning and parking and stuff that really doesn't apply to me. But at the end there, I basically got up and said my piece for 3 minutes and backed up some of the Navy people and some of the other folks that were there, and Kirsten, who spoke on behalf of the museum. And when I left there, I thought, I don't know how this is going to go. And the next day I get an email asking if I would sit in here today. And I said, yes, I will. So from 3:00 on until probably 3:30, Kirsten's going to be on talking with me about what's going on at the museum, what's happened at the air base. She has some great talking points. And I would urge you at that time, if you ever served in the military, especially at NAS Glenview, I'm going to want to hear from you at that time. And then to wrap all this up, I can't wait, because we're going to kind of ease our way out of here. At 3:30, I'm talking to my friend Christina Pentracosta, who is the owner of LaVilla restaurant right down the road on Pawlikowski, and not far from Milwaukee and Addison. And the reason she's on is twofold. Number one is they've been in business 50 years. There are very few businesses left in the Chicago area or any area family owned and operated for half a century, almost unheard of. The second part is they were just featured yesterday on America's Best, this television show, and they deserve it. It's incredible food there. So we're going to talk about the challenges and changes of running a business through all the ups and downs of all the regulations, all the other things that go into it, and how you make a nice pasta. Because after I leave her, I'm going to get some dinner, that's for sure. But before all that, I want to get into something that I think maybe we need to know, because, and this is a little tongue-in-cheek, so don't get too upset, none of what's going on today may matter in the long and short term. The odds of an asteroid impact in 2032 just went up. There's a killer asteroid on the way. But let me just say this ahead of time. I don't know why they weren't called hemorrhoids instead of asteroids. It's a joke I've been using for years. Paul's smiling. At least it worked a little bit. Here's why experts say you shouldn't worry, even though the headline says killer asteroid. The odds of the asteroid 2024 YR4 impacting Earth in 2032 have increased from 1 in 43. Despite this, you still shouldn't worry about the potential of impact. Yeah, tell Bruce Willis that when he's got to go up and start drilling to get. I hope he's doing well. That's because the experts expected the impact probability of this asteroid, which sits at the top center for the Near Earth Object Studies Century Asteroid Risk List. That's a lot. that it would increase. They also expect the chance of an impact to fall dramatically in the near future. This is really a non-story, but the killer asteroid thing kind of got me going. Back when Space.com first reported on 2024 WR4, the odds of it impacting Earth when it passed our planet 7 years ago were just 1 in 83, so it seemed like the chances of a strike have almost doubled. But there's another way to present those numbers. It's all about perspective. A 1 in 83 chance of an impact represents a 1.2% chance of an impact overall. That means it's all BS. So, one more thing before I ask Paul to run some audio here for me. When I'm on my podcast, I often will use words that I can't use on the regular radio. So I have a little Post-it note here that says, don't swear. And I got to watch myself. So I do know this, and I've done this before here. If you hear me say the word shirt, you know what I'm really saying. And I can get away with it because I already checked with the FCC. So, Paul, go ahead and run that Earth Matters, and I'll get back to it in a second.
Britain stands on the brink of doubling the amount of protected oceans in the world. But how do you really protect that much space? In her documentary, Mission Blue, conservationist Sylvia Earle calls for protection of 20% of the world's oceans and seas. That's a vast amount of water. And one major hurdle is, how would those waters be patrolled? The answer? What used to take ships can now be done by satellite. It was that fact that prompted the Blue Marine Foundation to create a dialogue and plan that was presented to the British government that is now under strong consideration. If the Brits approve the move, the world inches closer to that 20% protected status that might just end up being the critical number to keep the oceans and its creatures in balance as pollution, overfishing, and other human activity increases. The sobering fact is that we don't get any new water, and the more we can protect the lifeblood of the planet, the better off we are. I'm Bill Curtis, and Earth Matters.
So Bill Curtis and I produced, directed, he, of course, voiced most of the Earth Matters that you've heard me air on this show over the years, and it started back in 2014. Over 10 years ago, we started doing these, and we well over 320 some odd episodes. And whenever I would take the time to research one of those, they only are a minute long. It would usually take 2 to 3 hours. I wanted to get my sources right. I have to write it a certain way for him, and we delivered a certain way and put nice production behind it and all that type of thing. So it was our intent to make sure that we create something that is transformational and informational at the same time, and less than a minute long, because most people's time spans as far as they pay attention is basically evaporated over the years. So before I get into this little thing about the current president opening the dams about a week ago, I just want to go back to what Bill said, and I wrote years ago about that we don't get any new water. I just don't want to make sure you know this. If you were paying attention in 5th grade science, shout out to the late, great Mr. Andler at Belding Grammar School. If you were paying attention in 5th grade science, you know that we do not get new water. I just want to be clear on that. There's not a new drop of water on this planet. It changes form. It goes up. It goes down. It goes through the aquifers, does all the things it's supposed to do. But we live in a biosphere. It's like a giant terrarium, and everything that happens inside the biosphere and the terrarium stays in here. It doesn't go out somewhere. So even when you're flying at 35,000 feet, that's nothing compared to how far this thing goes. And there's this little protective layer around our planet called the ozone. And, of course, everything that comes inside here stays here. So when the rays of the sun come in, the ozone layer protects us. It's like sunscreen for the planet. Many years ago, there was obviously a problem with the ozone layer. We've all heard this, and it forced the Montreal Protocol in 1988. The Montreal Protocol was signed by almost every nation in the world, and the one that had not signed it was the United States. President Ronald Reagan was in the big chair at that time, and it took Maggie Thatcher, the Iron Lady, to get Ronnie to say, listen, she was a scientist. Here's the deal. If we don't take care of this, and if you don't take the lead here, this could go south real quick. And one of the big challenges is the incidences of skin cancer will be on the rise because the ozone layer is letting too much ultraviolet light in. Ronald Reagan had a couple bouts of skin cancer. Some of it was serious, and that was in his hip pocket. All of a sudden, it was a real problem. So he got on board, signed the Montreal Protocol. Everybody fell in line with that. And, of course, the manufacturers of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, Mr. Andler would be so proud of me. I remember all this stuff. Man, he'd be like, John, nice job. You get an A for the day. Go home early. I can't till after 4 o'clock. But he'd be all over this, as am I. And so chlorofluorocarbons were the propellants in refrigerations like air conditioning and things like that. Aerosol sprays, remember, they just stick your arm up and spray for a half hour. All that stuff was chlorofluorocarbons. And those propellants would go up and stay inside the skin of the ozone layer. They stay inside the biosphere. They don't go outside, they stay here. And you do that after about, 150 years of this stuff, it tends to build up and it caused a hole. There was eating a hole in the layer, the protective layer of the ozone. And so once that took place and started signing off, the people that made those chlorofluorocarbons, those propellants and those products, they weren't real happy. They thought it would be the end of an industry. We'd go without air conditioning. Refrigeration would fall off the map. Never happened. Why? Because science stepped in and found out other ways to create propellants, and even some of those are being phased out now to make sure that the environment, the biosphere, the thing we basically kind of need to live our lives, that it was to be as healthy as possible. So that's where a lot of this comes from. And I also will say, you wouldn't get the Montreal Protocol done now if the building was on fire. There's just, the division is too big. People have mocked science, and, some of that stuff, at least it was done then, because if it didn't, and it was going on now, we'd be up Shirt Creek, if you get my drift. So about 10 days ago, the current president opened 2 dams and let roughly 2.2 billion gallons of water flow out of reservoirs. The president ordered the release with the misguided intent to send water to fire-ravaged South California. We've all seen this horrible, horrible play out in L.A. County and what happened there. And so he said, I need to send this water to them, even though the fires were basically out. But it was a move to do this. We're going to send water down so they can tap into it, and they could use it to fight the rest of the fires. He declared that the water's flowing in California once again, adding the water was, quote, heading to farmers throughout the state and to Los Angeles, end quote, as the president said. 2 major problems there. The newly released water will not flow to Los Angeles. It's 200 miles away. There are no rivers or tributaries, streams or canals that bring the water there. And the water being released is being wasted for the wet winter season where it's collected, because the farmers use that reservoir of water to irrigate their crops. They were holding extra water in those reservoirs because the risk that it would be a dry summer, said Heather Cooley, the director of research for the California Water Policy Organization of the Pacific Institute. This puts agriculture at risk of insufficient water during the summer months. We don't get any new water ever. Then the president posted that 1.6 billion gallons are being released, adding that in 3 days it'll be a total of 5.2 billion gallons of water. And that water was discharged into the dry lake bed of Tulare Lake, and downstream entities used these releases for limited irrigation demand and groundwater recharge. And it went on to talk about how that the L.A. really, and I've known this for years, we should look it up, their water supply comes partly from state reservoirs and the Colorado River, which is already at record low levels. So when you look at what's going on, think about the house plants in your home. You can water them, and if it's in the wintertime where it's real hot and dry, they tend to dry out faster than they do in the summer. Yes? Yes. So you have to water them more, which means you need more of a resource to do that. So think about especially the avocado fields in California, tons and tons and tons of water they need just to grow avocados. Call Tom Selleck. He'll tell you about that. And you need to have that water to do things. That water, however, that was earmarked for all that irrigation and the farmers has been dumped and is in the ground somewhere, seeping through. It'll take years to go through the aquifers to replenish itself. So because the LA water sources are completely separated from the water systems that flow into anything close to them, the water system flows in the agricultural heavy Central Valley where large farms grow nuts and citrus and grasses. The water-stressed region is heavily reliant on groundwater and winter precipitation stored in state reservoirs, which are now empty. So for me, when I look at this stuff, this isn't about politics. This is about common sense. This is about the biosphere. This is about Mr. Andler's 5th grade class. And so I'll be calling this stuff out as I always do. I do it on my podcast. I still run the Earth Matters thing. I'm working with a couple groups to help them get the word out about this stuff, because whether or not the current administration guts the EPA for whatever reason, they don't need a reason, but if they do, then it falls on the public sector to figure things out. And so we're very, very, very fortunate, those of us living here on the Great Lakes. We have an abundance of fresh water. But even then, there's difficulty and challenges with that. So throughout the show, I'm going to be bringing some of this stuff up. I got 2 or 3 more Earth Matters to drop on you, and then we will follow up with some of the things I think that are important around that. But as I mentioned, tomorrow's Super Bowl Sunday. And I get the biggest kick out of Jerry Kramer. I don't remember if this is all in the clip or not, but I got to tell you how this started. I was a 10-year-old kid in 1968. We were on vacation in Appleton, Wisconsin, where our cousins lived. We stayed at the little Dreamland Motel right off the highway on College Avenue, 41 North. And that year, I should say, my dad bought a razor on vacation because we were heading back home. He's a banker. He's got to shave. The free gimme you got when he ordered this razor, I think it was a Schick or Persona, was a copy of a book called Instant Replay, The Green Bay Diary of Jerry Kramer, which has gone on to be, I don't know how many printings, done by Jerry and the great sports writer, the late Dick Schaap. My dad gets this book. We're at the motel. He looks at the book and he throws it in the garbage. He's a Bears fan. That's what you do. Me being 10 years old and not really steeped yet in the whole Bears culture, and of course I knew who Dick Butkus was and all that stuff, I took the book out of the garbage and I read it all the way back to Chicago. It took 3 hours. Now it takes about 2 hours. I drive a little different than my dad did. So that's how it started for me at 10 years old. And years later, I was working a project. I was able to connect with Kramer, and we've been friends ever since, almost 40 years in the making. And so every time I get a chance to talk with him around Super Bowl time, I think about there's less than 10 guys that played in that first Super Bowl and Super Bowl II. There's a few more from Super Bowl II, but very few from Super Bowl I. Jerry's now 89 years old. Sharp as a tack. And I thought before we get to the heavy-duty stuff, let's just take a little retrospective back for about 20 minutes or so and go back to 1967, 68, the land of Lombardy, and how things were back in the day. Paul, if you would. Jerry Kramer, who is one of the last few remaining athletes that played in Super Bowl I and Super Bowl II, whether that was against the Kansas City Chiefs in SB1 or the Oakland Raiders in SB2. The ranks of those gridiron heroes have been diminished greatly over the years. He's still kicking it at 87 years young, and I'll be talking with him in a few minutes about his memories of all that time of thing. But Super Bowl I is the only Super Bowl that never sold out. There were 32,000 empty seats, and there was a lot of reasons for that. The main one being is it was kind of just thrown together. You know, there was this merger of the AFL and the NFL, and they wanted to kind of see who was the top dog. And Lamar Hunt, the AFL, had the idea for this thing. But even just 3 weeks before kickoff, nobody knew where they were going to have the game at. So finally, the LA Coliseum was chosen. So it was a little different than it is today. The average ticket in 1967 when the game was played was $12. And I know Jerry's going to be talking about the time where he, at first Super Bowl, bought tickets for his family, as I recall. He got a big discount. They were only $10. And I don't think some of his family actually showed up. So these days, a ticket, the last I heard, going for $10,000. And even in the first time when they broadcast this, it was on 2 different networks. Nobody really knew what to do with all this. There was a blackout in Los Angeles that meant 15 million people within a 75-mile radius of L.A. couldn't watch the game unless they had some makeshift aerial antenna out of coat hangers and broomsticks in order to catch the signal from a television market. There were 2 second-half kickoffs because, as I mentioned, there's NBC and CBS were both broadcasting the game. So when the game resumed after halftime, the Packers kicked the ball off to the Chiefs, a play that half the country missed because NBC was still in a commercial break because a previous sideline interview with entertainer Bob Hope had run too long. That kind of pissed off Vince Lombardi. The refs whistled the play dead and told Green Bay to kick the ball off a second time. From that time on, every Super Bowl has sold out. It is the second largest watched sporting event in the world, only to World Cup soccer. And with NFL Europe and all the rest of this stuff going on, it has infused itself into the bloodstream of America for sure. And so every time this game rolls around, I start thinking about Jerry Kramer and a lot of those guys in that first Packer team. But Jerry in particular, we've been friends a very, very long time, decades. And to be clear, I'm a Bears fan. But I'm also a Kramer fan. I'm a football fan. I sure appreciate the effort that he put in. And, the story of how we met, I'll really condense this. But when I was a kid and his book, Instant Replay, came out, my dad got the book as a freebie when he bought a shaver up in Appleton, Wisconsin, where we were on vacation. And my dad was not as lenient in his view of the Packers as I am. And he threw the book in the garbage, this little paperback. And I was and still am a voracious reader, and I couldn't believe my dad would throw a book in the garbage. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know what it was. All I know is there was a picture of this football guy on the cover. I'm 10 years old, 11 years old at the time. So I fished it out of the garbage, and on a 3-hour drive from Appleton to Chicago, it only takes 2 hours now, but back then my dad drove like 50 miles an hour in his 1959 Impala, man. I read that entire book, and it just got into me at the right time, at the right place. I'm sure glad my dad thrown it out. Otherwise, I might not have ever read it. And there was something about teamwork and discipline and all the things that go into building not only a championship football team, but, of course, life as well. So that's kind of where all this started. And who knew that, 20-plus years, 25 years later, that I'd be working on a project and get a chance to work with Kramer, who I always admired but, had never contacted before. And we became fast friends. And we've done a lot of projects together, a lot of different things here and there. We put together this event a few years ago called Lessons from Lombardy, where we had Jerry on stage with all his props and football helmets and stuff. And I was tossing questions to him, and he was hitting them out of the park. And it was a great event, and we sure enjoyed doing it. And then there's the off-screen stuff, all the dinners and the road trips, and oh my gosh, it goes on and on. But this time of year, of course, he would be the guy that I would go to. And thinking about that instant replay book and the impact that it made, he and Dick Schaap, how it changed my life in so many different ways, and millions of people around the world that read that book. To this day, he's as sharp as they come. The machine's not working as good as it used to, but he's right there. And the more I talk to him, we'll probably talk once a month or so. He always said, well, all right, kid, what are you working on now? He was always grilling me on what's going on. And I have learned more and gleaned more lessons from life from Jerry Kramer than I think anybody else I've ever spent time with or worked with. And that's saying a lot because I've been with some incredible people, but there's something about his down home, down to earth, put your knuckles in the dirt, go get it mentality that vibrates with me and makes sense to me. And I think there's a lot of truth in that type of thing, whether you're doing it on the football field or in corporate America or your business, or your family. Those are the type of things I think that endure, and he's always about that. So without further delay, in all fairness and honesty and disclosure, this was taped yesterday, this little bit of the show, and we'll see what Mr. Kramer has to say about Super Bowl I and II, and I'll come back on the other side and finish it up.
Johnny, thank you very much for having me on. It's kind of an exciting time. I'm anticipating the big game, looking forward to it. Had some wonderful times in it, so it's near and dear.
So we go back to the first Super Bowl. One of the things I know for sure that it actually wasn't called the Super Bowl yet because that had really not been invented. It was the first AFL NFL World Championship game. It wasn't until a few years later that Lamar Hunt, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs, who were playing in the Super Bowl, coined the Super Bowl after recalling one of his favorite toys as a child, the Super Ball. Do you remember this?
Yes, I do. I thought it was one of Lamar's children, though, not Lamar.
Maybe.
But, it came from that camp.
Yeah, I can't imagine Lamar Hunt playing with a Super Ball, can you?
Just barely. I can just barely see him, yeah.
Yeah, so...
but
go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say, the build-up around this is just... The tickets are $10,000 a piece, Jer. I mean, come on. So they were $12 back in the day.
Hey, inflation. I bought 5 tickets for the game for my nephews, nieces in California, and they didn't show. And I'm getting to the point where I got to get dressed and get ready for a ball game, and I'm out by the gate waiting for them to show up, and they don't show, and they don't show. And I look over, and there are 5 or 6 kids playing in the dirt, killing time outside of the stadium. And I go, hey, you guys want to go to the ball game? Yeah. So I gave my 5 tickets, and it cost me $50. They were $10 tickets, so it cost me $50 to give the tickets away. But
oh my gosh,
the story has been worth it. Oh, and the other really big thing, kind of for me, the impactful thing was the space cadets. We had these. I don't think they were astronauts, but they did have a backpack that they flew around the inside of the stadium. They would fly at like 50, 60, 100 feet. but they were going back and forth. I thought that was the most exciting thing I'd seen in a long time. So it was a big deal.
Well, it was a big deal. It was a big deal. And yet, even though it was a big deal, and football, and you, of course, part of those Lombardi Packers starting to come into its own, it wasn't like it was with a big deal yet to the masses. I mean, it's certainly not what it's become now. And giving tickets away is kind of indicator of that. The fact that you had relatives that didn't even show up to the game kind of says, well, it's not that important. But obviously they were wrong.
Yeah. Well, there were 10,000 other empty seats in the Coliseum that day. So it took a lot of people by surprise, I guess, to see the way it came along and developed. And tickets today are, they're like 1,500, 2,000.
Jerry, you can't get a ticket now at this late date for less than $10,000.
Now that's inflation. That's what I call inflation. I wish my salary would have inflated along with the ticket price, but.
Yeah. And looking at that real quick, because I know that, you've always told a story about, can you tell the story about your bonus? Because I think people would appreciate the bonuses that were had back in the 60s when you guys were playing and what people are getting now.
Yeah, I was in the college all-star game and kind of hanging out a little bit here and there. I went to a game in San Francisco, kind of drafted by Green Bay, and I kind of was a little more into the pro football game. So I knew Green Bay was going to be down there, and I called them and told them I'd probably come along and I'd like to get a bonus. I wanted $8,000 and I wanted a $250 bonus. And Vern Llewellyn, who was the general manager at the time, said, "Jerry, we'll talk." So we get down to San Francisco. Wayne Walker was my pal, my center on the football team and the teammate and the classmate. And so we were hanging out, and I went to see Vern, and he wrote me a check for $250, and we signed a contract. And Wayne and I went out to party and have a good time and go yippee. It was pretty exciting, really. I mean, that's 8,000. Well, I didn't get the 8,000. I got the 500, but the promise of I got 250. The promise of 8,000 was a big number for me. So I get back to Green Bay, played the college all-star game, and drove up to Green Bay with one of the sponsors. And I get my first check after a week, and they've held out $250. And I went to see the general manager and told him that he'd made a mistake, that bonus shouldn't have been held out of my check. And he said, "Well, Jerry, that wasn't a bonus. That was an advance." And so we have to collect our advances. And so I didn't have a hell of a lot to say. I had a lot to think about, but I played for $7,250 and a $250 advance.
Not long after Lombardi got there, of course, you guys went from the worst in the league to the best in the league, started racking up championships and like that. And, whatever the idea was to put the AFL versus the NFL, because the AFL was the fledgling league. They were upstart. And, they had obviously some very good players over there, but they weren't the old guard, no pun intended. They weren't the National Football League NFC guys. And this whole idea of bringing the two together to have this big game, what did you guys think when, you're heading into this against the Kansas City Chiefs the first time, about their players and about the concept? And you already won the championship. You guys were already world champs. But what about this new level of playing the game in front of so many people for such high stakes?
Well, I'll give you a classic example. We were watching film Thursday evening. We'd watched a lot of film, but we were watching film in the evening, which was kind of unusual. And the opposing team to the Kansas City Chiefs had the ball, and they threw a pass, and two of the Kansas City Chiefs defensive backs ran into one another and knocked each other down. They both went to the ground, right? Oh. And Max McGee, who was the resident wit on the Packer team, said, "Hold it, run that back, run that back." So they ran it back again, and Mac goes, "Na na 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 na." He started doing Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, right? And the whole place is laughing. I mean, we're giggling and carrying on. So we didn't take them that seriously. We just assumed that it would be an exercise and we'd get it done with and go have us a beer and enjoy ourselves. So we got out there, and there's a kid named Buck Buchanan who was about 6'10", and about 300 and change. And he played on the tackle over Fuzzy. And I was pulling on a play. It was a quick fold. I pulled to my left. I'm right guard, so I pulled to my left. And then I go between the guard and tackle on the left side of the line. That's Fuzzy and Skoronsky. And then I kind of curl around the corner and get the middle linebacker. Well, I went by Big Daddy, and Fuzzy was chugging at his waistline and not having much success about moving him. And Big Daddy reached out a hand to me and I had a single bar on my helmet so I could see better, I guess, but I decided I wanted a single bar. And Big Daddy's hands went straight to my nose. And he buckled my knees. He just whaled me in the nose. I don't know if he broke it, but my eyes were watering, and I go straight to the equipment manager when we get back to Green Bay and tell him to put one of those big masks on.
Yeah, the big cage
on my helmet. I don't ever want to be seen with just a single bar again. But they had a lot of real good ball players. Bobby Bell, Curly Culp. A lot of the guys were pretty good players, and we were surprised by that because we had been brainwashed a little bit, I think, by the NFL kind of belittling their competition. Yeah, which was probably normal.
Yeah. Did you have any idea after the victory of that first Super Bowl? And I'm sure for Lombardi, this was like, if we lose to the AFC, we shouldn't even be putting our helmets on. But it turned out right for the Packers. Did you ever think it'd become what it is now, all these decades later, that it would just become this incredible event, besides football ratcheting up over the years, but this amazing event with the halftime shows? I don't know who the halftime, I think, was the USC marching band for you guys, and Al Hurt, maybe, the trumpeter. It's become this incredible worldwide spectacular. The amount of money generated just from commercials is astronomical. None of that was in play, no pun intended, in Super Bowl I and II.
I don't think anybody anticipated the growth of the game of professional football and the Super Bowls and the playoffs and the television coverage and how it was made for television. You know, it was a wonderful sport and a violent sport and the best athletes in the world, we like to say. So it was a bit of a surprise. And then, you know, the salaries increased with the increase in the fans. And so the guys are making more. They're making a game salary for us every week. You know, we played 12 months for it. They play one game, but they deserve it. They're gonna say a lot when they leave the game. They'll have a headache or a backache or some other problems, but that's another time, another place. Yeah. No, we didn't really. We wanted to beat Kansas City because we got 25,000.
Well, I was going to say there's an incentive there.
Yeah, it was like a whole salary. I mean, I think I was at that point I was getting 27 or 28 or something like that. I had a monster holdout about 3 years down the road when I went from 9 or 10 to 18 or 19, and then which was, Coach Lombardi was making 35.
Yeah.
His first 5 years, so it was not a way to retire.
Yeah.
Very comfortably.
The next year, in 1968, you guys go to Super Bowl II. Now you're playing the Oakland Raiders. And that year, you guys had a record of 9-4-1. The Raiders come in at 13-1. That's pretty serious hardware. You guys beat them 33-14. What was it like going into Super Bowl II after the experience of Super Bowl I? Now you're going to face the Oakland Raiders with Ben Davidson and the crew. What was that like?
It's a little more serious. We really got a taste of the AFL and Super Bowl I, and they had some really good athletes. So we had changed our whole attitude and our whole mind and our preparation for a good football team and not just a bunch of guys. So we always felt like we could win. I don't think ever went into a game that we didn't think we were going to win. And we generally paid the price to win, emotionally, physically, whatever it happened to be.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a tough game against the Raiders and had a wonderful outcome. And so we later got to know Mr. Stram a little bit at a couple golf outings, and he was still making excuses for the loss in the Super Bowl 2 or 3 years later.
Yeah.
But I got to enjoy him a little bit too. He's a good guy.
Mm.
It was the whole journey was just what a way to. Coach Lombardi ended his career in Green Bay after Super Bowl II. He went on to Washington, and I played one more year. I had a wonderful moment when I finished my career. It was the last game in Green Bay in '68, and it's the fourth quarter, and we're down 3 points, and we have the ball, and we're moving across midfield, and we're going to score. We always have. We always will. Don't worry about it. We're going to score. We're going to win. Run another play, and we fumble. The opponent recovers, and I start walking off the field. I look up at the clock, and there's about a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes left to go, and I say to myself, it's over. It's over. We're not going to win. We're not going to go to the championship. We're not going to be in the playoffs. And I hear a smattering of applause coming from the stands. And I turned and I said, it's over. Don't you understand? It's over. We've lost. We're not going to be champions. And I walked back to the bench where I was sitting, and the people were standing up and applauding and applauding. And pretty soon the whole stadium was roaring. And I said, oh, they understand. They know. They're saying thank you. Thank you for all the victories, for all the years. This may be the end of an era, but thank you.
In all honesty, you and I had a conversation earlier today before we had this one, and I asked you about Invictus, and you just rolled right into it. And I don't know if it's the sound of your voice or whatever, but to me, I think when they wrote it, they were thinking about you, even though football wasn't invented at that point, and how you came through all the things you've come through. You've overcome some serious physical challenges to play the game. You've had some challenges off the field, of course, as well. But it really sums up a lot of what I think football's about, what you're about, what the game's about, what it means to be someone who's upright and breathing and, making a difference in the world. So as we get ready to lock this down for today, can you share with us Invictus one more time, my friend?
One of my favorite pieces, Johnny. Out of the night that covers me, dark as a pit from pole to pole, I thank the Lord above for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. And under the bludgeonings of fate, my head is bloody, but unbowed. In this pale of gloom and tears looms but the shadow of the glade. And yet the passing of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate, and I am the captain of my soul.
I'll tell you something right now. I got the hairs on my arm are standing up, and I've known this guy for 40 years. I've been on stage with him when he delivered that Invictus poem. And in particular, one time we were doing this Lessons from Lombardy event, and he finishes all the events that way. And he's sitting in this giant chair. You got to get this image. He's sitting in this giant overstuffed leather chair on a little table next to him. He's got this very famous picture of him with Vince Lombardi on his shoulder. Forrest Gregg's in that picture as well from Super Bowl I. His beat up old helmet sitting there. You know, there's a football sitting there. And there's 500 people in the audience. For the last hour and a half, they've been listening to this guy tell stories about a very, very special time in sports history around those first two Super Bowls in that Lombardi era. And he finishes the event with this Invictus thing that you just heard. And on purpose, I had the stage people start to lower the lights real slow as Jerry was talking, just to kind of bring the mood down, you know. And I would see the people, 500 people sitting in seats, starting to lean in their chairs to him towards the stage as he leaned in his chair towards them off the stage. And the energetic exchange culminating in 90 minutes of these stories, a lot of laughter, a lot of BS, and all the rest of the stuff that goes into pro football from this guy who is a living piece of NFL history was unbelievable and palpable to me. It literally, to this day, still gives me chills. So as I mentioned, you know, he's 89 now, so you heard that dated reference of him being 87, but he's 89. He's out today doing his thing with his autographs and stuff like that. And every time I listen to his voice, I think of the many conversations we had, the places we've been, the adventures we've had, and all the pieces that go along with that. And I think about how he has maintained this discipline of what got him to the Hall of Fame. In 2018, he, after 22 rejections from the Canton Pro Football Hall of Fame for various reasons over the years, he was inducted in 2018. His daughter, Alicia, went to social media and said, "This is wrong. My dad was on all these, the Lombardi teams. He's on the NFL All 50-year team. He's on the Century team. All the stuff he's accomplished, prolific author, 3, 4, 5 books, all the stuff he's done for the game, and he was never put in Canton." So finally, she got social media involved, and then she started getting letters written from opponents he played against and what they thought of him. So pretty soon the groundswell was just too much to ignore. I remember right before this happened in 2018, probably 2 years or 3 years earlier, a vote was taken. He missed by 1 vote. I called him afterwards and I said, "How you doing?" He goes, "I'm going fishing for a year." And he did. He said, "I was basically done with the game at that point. I don't want to hear about it anymore." His daughter steps in and says, "Let's do this one more time." And I'll never forget being on a different radio station here in Chicago. And, sorry about that. I don't think did I get the button? No, I guess I didn't.
No.
Oh,
You're good.
I'm good. Okay. So I'm sitting there. I was doing an overnight shift for CBS. I don't remember the name of the show. I was on for a couple of weeks, and I was like from 11 at night till 5 a.m. Try that in your socks overnight for about 2 weeks. It's quite an experience. But I had her on talking with me about what was going on. So it was in Idaho where she lived. Big time difference. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning here. It's midnight there. I'm doing the show with her, and she's talking about her dad. The phone lines at 3 a.m. Central Time lit up like a Christmas tree as people called in to talk about their memories of the Ice Bowl, the greatest block that Kramer ever threw in football, and arguably the greatest block in football. But more importantly, how that innocent time really has changed their lives. And I was basically stunned. Call after call came in support of this guy who, from markets all over the country, they didn't care about it was the Packers. They cared about quality football and who the guy was. So in 2018, my highly significant other and I were very, very just blown away that we were invited to go to Canton, be there for Jerry. And I remember walking into the reception ahead of the event that night, the football game in Canton, and before his speech and all that. And there's got to be 500 people there, 500 of Jerry Kramer's best friends. That's the kind of guy he is, milling about, and him walking up, and just he's got tears in his eyes. And he just looks at me, and only the kind of look you can have with someone you know and have kind of gone up and down with, around the bend with, had great deep conversations at 4 a.m. with. And he just, the look on his eyes was like a 25-year-old kid. Just one of the greatest things. So I hope you enjoyed that interview. Jerry Kramer's presence in my life, out of all the people I've spent time with, is probably right at the top of the list. Anyway, we got to take care of a little business right here, get to a commercial break, come back with more right after this.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
We're back out on WCPT. Before we get to my guest in just a couple minutes, we're going to also hear one of their Earth Matters, as I promised. But Monday from 5 to 7, Patty Vasquez, my pal Patty, will be joined by positivity expert and podcaster Jen Zanotti and Jeff Badu, licensed certified public accountant and founder and CEO of Badu Enterprises, LLC. That's Driving It Home with Patty Vasquez, 5 to 7 p.m. on Central Time on WCPT 820 AM right here, the Heartland Signal website, TuneIn, YouTube, and Facebook. Paul?
If humans cause climate change, then why did the dinosaurs go extinct? Asks a Florida congressman. When GOP Congressman Jeff Miller was asked if he was concerned that voters are starting to believe the majority of scientists who agree that human industry and development are contributing factors to climate change, the congressman cited the fact that no humans were around to blame when the dinosaurs went extinct. There are a few creationists who think life was like a Flintstones cartoon. But the fact 97% of scientists agree that human activity is accelerating weather patterns with the buildup of greenhouse gases over the past century. As the political races heat up, voters are starting to decide for themselves what actions need to be taken to slow down the human impact on climate change, even with dinosaurs in Congress denying the overwhelming evidence. Earth Matters. I'm Bill Curtis.
There are people, I think, that believe that the Flintstones is a documentary. I've run into a few where it's like, yeah, they really lived together. Okay. On to other things. I can't have a conversation with somebody like that. That's, there was a day that I would kind of say, let's get our backs up against the wall and go toe to toe and see who comes out at the top with this. But as I said earlier, rational people should not argue with people who are irrational. It's a derailing technique. It reminds me of people in denial. I've brought this up a number of times over the years. My mom was a heavy smoker, and she got away with it for a very long time. Benson and Hedges Gold, I would have to get her. I could use the car if I went out and got her a carton of cigs back in the day, which was like $6. And she smoked like a chimney for years and years and years and years. And when she developed cancer near the end of her life, she was shocked. I wasn't surprised. My dad wasn't surprised. My sister wasn't surprised. But my mom thought she was somehow going to get away with it. There is something about denial in our human makeup that has us look at scientific evidence and say, well, that doesn't apply to me. And I don't know anybody that this stuff doesn't apply to. As I mentioned earlier about, going back to fifth grade, science class, this stuff is so elementary, no pun intended, to me. It makes no sense when people go, that's not true. I can't work with that. So I call on people maybe to help me do that a little bit better. Father John Pawlikowski, a PhD, is a professor emeritus of social ethics and Catholic Theological Union. He has been an active participant in the Christian-Jewish dialogue as well as the wider interreligious dialogue for nearly 50 years. He has served for 6 years as president of the International Council on Christian and Jews and has served several terms on the board of the Parliament of the World's Religions. He was deeply involved in the development of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, having served 4 terms on its board by presidential appointment. All that's impressive, but what caught my eye was articles about Father John talking about our responsibility when it comes to the planet, which is something I grew up with as a normal thing, but now it's kind of abnormal, so I thought we'd get his perspective. Father, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
So, in all full disclosure, we did have a conversation yesterday for about 40 minutes. My pre-interview is almost be about 10 minutes, but we really got into some interesting concepts and thoughts. And my first thing is, what is it in your faith that has you working in this direction, kind of this late in your career, for lack of a better term, when it comes to the environment? What is it that pulls you towards this and drives you?
Well, I would say the seeds were planted quite a number of years ago. In fact, it was on Labor Day weekend of 1970. I was a participant. One time only meeting of every conceivable organization that had to do with academia and religion. And the keynote speaker was Professor Hans Jonas. Professor Jonas was a German Jew who managed to leave Germany before the time for Hitler really went down. And that influence got a position at the new school in New York City. And his notes that called with the title the imperative possibility.
Father, we're going to let you go and try and call you back. I don't know. It sounds like you're kind of swimming somewhere, and I know that you're not. We're going to try and get a better signal. And in lieu of that, let me just jump over to something that can we go back to this arithmetic thing and how this all falls together. What Father was talking about, and he and I spoke about yesterday, was back in 1970, of course, is when Earth Day started, which was basically a movement that came out of decades of environmental degradation because there was zero oversight on corporations. So if you're in the camp that thinks that the government has too much overreach when it comes to the environment, probably not your kind of show. But I'm here to tell you that if you think that human morality will be the guide as opposed to greed, I'm telling you that they get confused a lot. So back in 1970, when the EPA was first brought around, when Richard Nixon was the president, came out of the fact that the Cuyahoga River, this was the trigger point, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio literally burst into flames one day. There was so much shirt in there that the combination was lethal, and the fire started on top of the water of a river. Now, you can imagine how we all looked at this back in the day going, how is it possible that a river can catch on fire? Well, there was very little river left, and it was all garbage. And that's what the Cuyahoga had become, which was a sewer. I've told this story before, and it bears repeating. My dad and I used to work on cars all the time out in front of the house. I always loved having time with him doing that. And 4 times a year, he would change the oil. This is before quickie oil change places. So my dad was a handy guy. Let's change the oil out front. And he would pull the plug out of the oil pan, and it would drop down into the ground on the side where the curb is, and it would just run in. So you got 4 or 5 quarts of oil, black gold, running out, and it would just make this stream and hang on everybody's tires all the way on its way towards the sewer. When my dad had finished with that, he put the plug back in, we put the new oil in. He would drag the hose out if it was warm enough, and he would wash the oil down into the sewer. So after a couple of years of this, as I started to get a little bit older, I think it was probably right around the time the fire started on the river, I said, "Hey, Dad, what's the deal? You know, why are you washing this down into the sewer? Where does it go?" It just goes into the sewer. Well, but where's the sewer go? Well, I don't know. It goes into the system. Well, what system is that? You know, the Chicago water system. Well, how do they clean it? You know, of course, my dad didn't know anything past it goes into the sewer. He was just making it up. But I stayed after him with this, about this whole thing about, you know, where does the waste go? And so when this whole thing with the EPA was starting to ramp up with Nixon, the fact of the matter was he created the EPA, Tricky Dick Nixon, not because he was a great environmentalist and thought it's because there was a groundswell of votes out there that said we need to do something. So he created the Environmental Protection Agency. Not out of being a great environmentalist, but doesn't matter to me. He put things in place that started to regulate what was going on with corporations that was using the waterways, the highways, and the byways as garbage cans. I'm sure there are some of you listening that remember what it was like when you'd pull up to a stop sign or a stoplight and somebody throw their garbage out the window like it was just a trash can. Or that they would dump their ashtray out. Do you ever remember that? They'd pull the ashtray out of the car and dump it right at where they stopped. So all this stuff would go on, and that was just normal. There was even a commercial on television of a guy who was actually Italian, dressed up like as a Native American, and he was kind of canoeing through the rivers and things. He'd see this garbage everywhere. And there was an awareness that took place then. People, guess what, stopped throwing garbage on the streets. What a concept. So eventually my dad got to the point where he would put a cutout 5-gallon can of oil that was old underneath the car and catch it. Then he'd store it under our porch, like a super fun cleanup site. So at least it was progress. And eventually, as these quickie places opened up, that went away, and you got, discarded oil and stuff. So it's a process, and that's what Father John was talking about. And I think we got him back, right, Paul? Father, you with us?
Yes, I am.
Oh, much better. Much better.
Okay.
I don't know how much of that you heard, but I was talking about my experience back in 1970.
Yes, I heard the ending of it. I was explaining that I had this initial experience, and Hans Jonas, giving the keynote address, kind of looked down at us and caught our eyes in a sense and said, "You," and I was much younger then. He said, "You in the room who are the younger generation, you may be the first generation to have to ask the question whether further generations will be possible because of what's happening to the planetary situation." And that just planted seeds in me that have persisted for a long time. I didn't follow up, as you already indicated, I didn't follow up academically that much on this, in part because in my teaching obligations, my colleague, one of my colleagues who was also teaching in the same area, wanted to do the ecological. So I always included it in a class, but I didn't dwell on it that centrally until I really connected with the actually in 1980, I was appointed to be the theological advisor for a new commission established by the Catholic bishops of the United States through some grants to investigate the whole issue of energy. It was a more restricted than ecology as a whole, but it really further drew me into this discussion. And certainly once Pope Francis came into the picture and published his groundbreaking encyclical on the subject, which received tremendous acclaim and support from the scientific community, that really got me involved very deeply, primarily through the Parliament of the World's Religions.
Father, what do you think it is that stops humans, and not all of us, but some of us, from taking further sustainable action when it comes to the environment, to the planet, the very source of life on this earth, which is the water and all that goes along with it and all those pieces? What is it? What's our Achilles heel? What is it that there's such a resistance from some people to say this really doesn't matter? Is it because they haven't seen any of the effects in their own life at this point? I talked about my mom earlier who smoked and thought she could get away with it. But now we're seeing things that are taking place in the world that, we've never seen before in so many different ways. But from a faith-based perspective, what is our obligation, and what do you think it is that keeps people from it?
Well, I would say there's several causes. First of all, I think there is a denial reality about this that I don't fully explain. You actually addressed it earlier on in your comments a bit. And I think people just deny. But part of the denial, I'm afraid, is enhanced by the rapidity of our news cycle now. Mm-hmm. We get these horrendous stories about what happened in Lahaina, what happened in North Carolina, what happened in Juneau, Alaska, and things like that. But they last for 1 or 2 days, and then they're gone. Right. And it's true, if people haven't experienced directly, we had some serious flooding here in the Chicago area a couple years ago, that really, in the Austin area of the city, and also in the suburb of Cicero. But people forget about it very quickly. But I would say there's also, I think for many Christians, and I speak primarily as Catholic Christians, we had a deep-seated sort of, I don't know, a hatred of the earth was too strong, but so much of our prayer tradition spoke about our time here on earth as exilic. And if you're going to say you're an exile on the earth, I don't think you're going to have much incentive to try to preserve it. Rather, on the contrary, you might want to hasten its destruction. And actually, we once had the Secretary of the Interior named James Watt.
Oh, boy, I remember Watt.
Yes, and he once said publicly that there was no need to preserve the natural forest and so on and the natural habitats because everything was going to, Jesus was coming soon, and everything was going to be destroyed anyway. So maybe we're just enhancing it by ignoring the issue. I remember I was at an event at the Kennedy Center in Washington, and next to me was my good friend, then Representative Father Robert Drinan, the Jesuit, who served in Congress for a number of years. And when we walked in, he said, "Look over those." When Watt walked into the room, he told me, "Look over there." He said, "All the trees are bending down."
You know, I remember reading, you know, in Genesis where the wording says, "And man was given dominion over all things," and I took. Right, and I
was just going to say, you know, that's been a real issue because,
people have taken that literally.
Well, I think it's also you could make the argument, and a number of prominent scripture scholars did, that that is really a mistranslation. That the Hebrew Aramaic behind that is not necessarily best translated as dominion. But nonetheless, we did have a notion of life in the world as a hierarchy with humanity at the top, and you know, there were times in the religious tradition when we really said nature was totally inert, and we could do anything to it because it really didn't carry any life. So that's the course where Pope Francis has just completely changed the official mindset, if you want, of the church with his emphasis on ecological spirituality. And the other thing, too, that I think has been very strong is, frankly, the Hubble telescope.
How so?
The Hubble telescope has opened up the planetary reality to a much wider comprehension than we ever had. And I think we have to see that Teilhard de Chardin, the well-known Jesuit scientist, began to explore the connection of religion and the newer understanding of planetary existence. But then that kind of fell by the wayside until Pope Francis picked it up and has really stressed what he calls biodiversity, which some people in religious circles have developed the notion of that we live in a web of creation, where everything is interconnected. And I strongly believe that, but that's a long way from becoming a commonplace in religious thoughts.
Yeah. So we have a couple 3 minutes left here. What do you suggest to people of faith to look at, whether it's in Scripture or other readings, that they can draw strength on. And so I'm all about action. I mean, it's great to sit and have great, deep discussions, but I want to do something with the time that I have. So in addition to maybe where you can point them in religious Scripture, what do you suggest people do to make every day Earth Day, for lack of a better term?
Well, I would say you need to read the writings of I think, both Pope Francis, and you need to read the writings of the Secretary General of the United Nations, because both of them have become powerful voices in this area. And we also need to look at Bill McKeegan's writings. I mean, he was a real pioneer in this area. I think actually you can read the book of Genesis in a way that does not lead to domination, that really leads much more to a sense of responsibility. And then we have to not only read about that, we do have to begin the education process for activism. We really need to become active in this area if we're going to meet the challenge. And I can say, for example, there is now a 10-year program begun in the Archdiocese of Chicago high schools to really prepare students for such understanding of the issue and also concrete commitment to the issue. I think the younger generation is our hope.
So my Native American friends used to say there are really 5 elements that make up all of this whole thing we call life here. There's the earth itself, with all the rocks and the canyons and things, the earth itself, the planet. Then you got all the vegetation, from the smallest weed to the giant redwood, all that covers this planet, the hair of Earth. And then you have the atmospheres. You have the water and the air and all that goes in along with that. Then you have all that swims, crawls, walks, and flies, how those 4 things are all connected in harmony. And then the 5th are the humans. But the big kicker here, of course, is that the first 4 elements, they don't need us at all. And so here we are, late to the game, maybe, depending on who you talk to in an archaeological point of view, how many thousands of years we've been here. But for sure, the last 200 years or so, 250 years of the Industrial Revolution and the damage that's been done. And I was talking before about my dad putting oil in the sewer and not knowing where it goes, totally ignorant of the fact that it would end up in the river at some point without being cleaned and how that all works. And so he changed his ways. And I ask you said something about the young people obviously being the future here. Do you have that deep faith and hope that, as Buckminster Fuller said, we will, spontaneous action can come out of very difficult circumstances? Do you have that? Are you seeing that when you spend time with the Parliament of World Religions? Do you see things moving in a good direction?
I see them moving in a promising direction that I think, if carried on and picked up more widely, can address the issue. I'm not the one who has yet given up on the possibility of planetary survival, as some have. But it's going to be a challenge, and I think with the President Trump administration, it's going to be a significant challenge. I'm encouraged by the fact that just on Friday, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs released a survey which shows that nearly 67% of Americans want us to stay in the Paris Climate Accords. Even 50% of Republicans came out in favor of retention there. So there is, I think, some acceptance of the issue and a desire to continue significant effort to make the challenge among a growing number of people. And I find, especially at the college and university levels, and increasingly even at the secondary schools.
So just before I let you go, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day. I've enjoyed our conversation yesterday and the one today. I hope we have more in this direction. And the thing that I've come away with from talking with you yesterday and in this interview is that it really does come down to a matter of faith. I mean, you have to have faith that things can be better than they are. Is that, by the way, have you seen The Conclave yet?
I saw excerpts of it.
Okay. So I watched it last night. I was thinking of you, actually, when I was watching The Conclave last night. And really, some of it, outside of all the drama that's around it, I'm not going to spoil it for anybody listening, but it really boiled down to faith is believing in what you cannot yet see, and then seeing what you've believed in without seeing them. And that's what the essence of faith is. So as we move forward, when it talks about environmental challenges, things like that, we have to find the faith in ourselves to know that there are ways to change these things and that we are stewards of the planet and that we can make this happen. Even though we don't see it today, it can happen tomorrow. True?
True, and I think our Native brothers and sisters can be a great assistance there. And Pope Francis made that point very strongly when he came to Canada to apologize to the indigenous community for the church's support of the so-called doctrine of discovery.
Yeah, Father John Pawlikowski from the Catholic Theological Union. So honored to have you on, sir, and I hope I talk to you again soon. I appreciate the time.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that was really interesting, and I almost didn't bring that Conclave thing up, but I couldn't help myself. It's a fantastic movie. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. And, of course, you can go online and look up Father John Pawlikowski's name. He is all over the Internet. This guy is incredible what he's accomplished in his faith career. We're going to take a short time. I'll come back with more after this.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Good to be sitting with you in WCPT here. I just really admire this gentleman who's been doing this amazing work. I can't even begin to tell you. The conversation we had yesterday that you did not hear was just as riveting, and I appreciate the notes I'm getting on Facebook and from people listening to the show saying that, they're really enjoying the direction that we're taking. Coming up in just a few minutes, we're waiting to have the former governor of New Jersey, Todd Whitman, call in. Governor Whitman and I have done quite a few shows over the years, and hopefully she can get the number right and all is well in the world. But before that, I want to let you know that next week on Live, Local, and Progressive, Joan Esposito will be talking to Courier Newsroom correspondents Cameron Stevenson and Colin Booth, Salon.com's Amanda Marcotte, and the Tribune's environmental reporter Michael Hawthorne, ProPublica's Brett Murphy, DePaul's journalist-in-residence Chris Beery, Wisconsin Congressman Mark Pocan, and more on Live, Local, and Progressive weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. Central on WCPT AM, the Heartland Signal website, and tune in. I thought I was busy. Joan's got a really busy week coming up. Also on Choose Views, Richard will be talking to the president of the National Philip Randolph Pullman Porter Museum. What a cool thing that is. You really need to check that out. The executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy, the director of Illinois PRG, Dr. William Keyes, the fourth author of The Stories They Hear, Expecting Greatness is the Key to Success. Do you see some of these things running through the shows? Patty's talking with somebody who has done some work in a positivity expert kind of thing, and Richard's talking with someone about the stories they hear. Expecting greatness is the key to success. It's not just beating our gums on politics, because you got to still live your lives and move it in a direction that makes some sort of sense, no matter what's going on in the headlines. To not get distracted, to not lose your life in so many ways over stuff you can't control. It is the thing, in my observation, experience, and opinion, that'll send you off to PTSD land. You don't need to end, your days that way. Choose Views weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. Central on WCPT AM 820. Again, the Heartland Signal website, tune in, YouTube, and Facebook. Some of the other stuff I got sitting here while I wait for the governor to get a hold of us is this whole thing about tariffs. I hate to keep going back to grammar school and high school on some of this stuff, but, I learned about tariffs when I was in high school, Econ 101. And so tariffs have always been a part of the landscape of the government. Every government in the world does it to some greater or lesser degree. And so when I heard that President Trump was going to impose a 25% tariff on Canada, our neighbors to the north, I was a little concerned, more than a little concerned, because that meant one thing, personally to me. I don't think I know anybody in Canada really, but it doesn't matter. What did matter is that my Moosehead beer was going to cost more money. That means I had to get to Benny's Beverage Depot pronto. They're not even a sponsor of the show. But I'm not kidding. This is exactly what happened. When I heard this was going on, that he was going to put these tariffs on China and on Canada and Mexico, I'm thinking avocados and I'm thinking Moosehead beer here. So as been explained many, many times before, and I've watched these YouTube videos, which I found fascinating. There are people who really don't know how a tariff works. And they're terrified of tariffs. I just came up with that. A tariff is a paid tax by the U.S. importer who brings it in. So when Moosehead sends it to Benny's, Benny's pays the tariff to them. The producer of Moosehead beer, the Moosehead folks, have already gotten their money. Done and over. That's it. Then Benny's, or whoever the importer is in between those two, they pay that. It's already done. So by the time it gets to me, guess who pays them back? Not the Moosehead people, but whoever imported it, whether it's Benny's or somebody else. I do. And that comes in the form of higher prices. So, literally they were supposed to go into effect Tuesday morning. Monday night, cold out, in the dark, I'm headed to Benny's Beverage Depot to buy up as much Moosehead beer as I can because I'm taking the current president at his word. Tomorrow, we're dropping the hammer on Canada, Mexico, and China. Now, I don't get much stuff from China. Here and there, something will show up. Avocados, yeah, okay, well, I'll just take. But don't mess with my Moosehead beer, man. I mean, come on. This is serious shirt for me. So I'm out there at Benny's. I'm expecting this place to be crammed full of human beings. There's nobody there. I'm thinking, where's everybody at? Literally nobody in Benny's in Riverside. So I go there, I get 4 cases of Moosehead beer. I think that's good. I get to the counter, I'm thinking to this woman, she thinks I'm an alcoholic, which I'm not. I just like Moosehead. I don't even buy it that often, but I'm thinking I need to stock up because tomorrow the shirt's going to hit the fan. The president said so. We're dropping the boom. That's it. We're going to hammer Canada in the ground 25%, and John's going to pay more for his Moosehead beer. Not on my watch. So I went and bought it, stocked up. I'm checking out. Ladies looking at me like, are you all right? I'm like, yeah, I don't do this very often. That's what everybody says when they come here. Yeah, okay. So I get in the car. Take the Moosehead home. I get it all stocked up. I'm waiting for the glory of the next morning when I could say, look, now you're all paying more and I didn't. And nothing happened. Nothing happened. And so here we go with this whole rhetoric thing about what is said and what is done, which are two very, very different things. And all I know is that at some point, I will have a deal. I just don't have the deal yet. At some point, when the 25% tariff goes up, of course, then I will have made the deal. I haven't even really had a Moosehead yet, but tomorrow on Super Bowl Sunday, I definitely will, because I paid less for it than somebody else will in about 2 weeks, apparently, or maybe 3 weeks. But here's the other part of it. In retaliation, of course, Canada slaps $155 billion tariffs on goods coming from the United States there. So what does that mean? That means somebody here is going to pay for it here. They're going to pay for it over there. And next thing you know, Jed's not a millionaire and nobody's happy. So the end result of all this rhetoric and stuff like that is always, I probably shouldn't have taken the hook in the mouth like I did. But look, it's Moosehead beer, man. I've been drinking this stuff since '83. You know how much money I've pumped into the Canadian economy in all those years? And then I figured it out. This was not about tariffs. This was about getting John to buy more beer. That's exactly what it was. We're going to take a short time out, see if we can figure out what's going on behind the scenes here. Paul, if you would, take care of a little business. We'll be back after this.
As the ongoing debate over climate change continues to heat up, the concept of denial takes on a whole new meaning. The scientific community has a split decision when it comes to the notion that human activity plays a role in the warming of the planet. It's not a 50-50 split decision. It's 97% who agree that the massive buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has to do with our carbon footprints, and 3% who insist that all that is occurring is simply part of the natural cycles of Earth. To be clear, most of the 3%ers are on the payroll of oil and energy companies. The DNA of denial has a slew of talking heads in the media, pounding away at the solid scientific evidence, and companies spend millions to create doubt around climate change. Perhaps if they spent millions to develop green energy sources instead, they would be more profitable in the long run. What a concept. I'm Bill Curtis for Earth Matters.
Transitioning from being a Marine to a civilian was very hard. I lost my purpose. I lost the drive that I had. That is a very dark and lonely place to be. It took me surrendering to myself to get the help that I needed. At my very first Wounded Warrior Project event, I met Ray Pizarro. He told me, you need to have the courage to forgive yourself for the things you've done in the past. I got it tattooed on my hand. One night, my depression kept telling me, you can end this. And just before I was about to pull the trigger, I looked down at my hand, and that's what saved my life that night. That was the beginning of my incredible journey with the Wounded Warrior Project.
See how we help warriors combat stigma at woundedwarriorproject.org/combat stigma.
This is a WCPT moment in labor. In the 1830s in Lowell, Massachusetts, during the rise of the textile industry, factories were hiring large groups of women ranging in ages 18 to 35 to work at their mills. The workdays were 13 hours long and had poor working conditions. By 1834, the textile market was sluggish. In response, the workers' wages were reduced by 12.5%. One of the workers, Julia Wilson, tried to organize the women to get their wages back, only to be terminated abruptly. Wilson signaled the women to strike or turn out. Over 800 women marched and signed a petition saying we will not go back into the mills to work unless our wages are continued. Ultimately, the strike failed, but they learned from their mistake and successfully battled back a rent increase on their boarding houses 2 years later. By January 1845, about a dozen of the Lowell female textile workers came together to form the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. This would become the first organized union of women workers in American history. This has been a WCPT Moment in Labor. We're working for your rights.
The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath, Saturdays at 1 p.m.
Count me among the Americans that want to see change. Now, of course, the change I was looking for would have put Kamala Harris in the White House. Americans voted for change. They just, Trump, I think they got the wrong kind. Still, I'm grateful for elections, even when we lose. They tell us about ourselves, and we can't ignore that and shouldn't.
The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath, Saturdays at 1 p.m.
I was looking for, a few years ago, woosah. It ain't here. Got to stand the fight. And you should be standing on the shoulders of your ancestors if you're whatever community you come from. Because they had a little bit harder fight than we do today.
Richard Chew, weekday mornings at 6 on WCPT 820. You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Back at it right here. I'm sitting in for Edwin today. He'll be back, of course, next week and mushing on with that. He has a podcast, actually. It's its own podcast. 2, actually. They should write this in a different way, but hey, I'll go with it. Full episodes and featured interviews. Just search The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath wherever you get your podcasts, or get the podcast links on the show page by visiting theheartlandsignal.com/ and clicking on Edwin's picture, and it'll take you right to those podcasts. I can tell you, I never thought podcasts would be a thing. Of course, I didn't think the Cubs would ever win a World Series either, but it's been a really interesting process for me to do these podcasts and to reach the world from my own studio at home in Chicago, in the greater Chicago and lesser Chicagoland area. And a couple of years ago, I think it's going on 4 years ago now. Wow, it's 5 almost. In 2020 to 2021, I did a podcast, which was podcast in form, but also in radio form, which was a bit of a hybrid, when I was hosting a show called The Bridge. And I was here in Chicago, and my co-host was in Beijing, China. And so we did 7 shows and taped 7 shows in 5 days. These are hour-long shows. And the technical aspects of that were enormous. Was able to, first of all, the time difference was 13, 14 hours ahead in Beijing. So I'm doing shows 7, 8 o'clock at night here, and it's already mid-morning there and going into their day. So the technical pieces of pulling it off took a little bit of doing. We finally figured all that stuff out. And interestingly enough, the 2 hosts that I work with the most, one was Bebe, who is still a host on China Radio International and does a show called Roundtable, where they have conversations about all things going on in China. And Bebe Ren, who was a previous host on that channel, they were my 2 co-hosts. They were the ones that kind of came in and out and worked with me. And I got to tell you, I had a little bit of trepidation, as they did with me. They figured every guy in the United States was John Wayne. Kind of not John Wayne, but that's kind of how they saw me, and that's what they were expecting, was that, come on, sister, let's go. I'm not that guy all the time. Maybe sometimes, but not all the time. And I didn't know what to expect of them. It's a communist country. I didn't know what I was getting into, but a fellow named Dan Mason, who was the president of CBS Radio for many years, and he and I have worked on a lot of projects, and he said, you're the guy to host this, and I agreed with him. So when we started, I was more concerned about the technical pieces and the time difference and then producing all this stuff than it was conversing with them. I thought that would find its own level, and it did. And the shows that we put together were just fascinating to me. You spend a year with somebody, never once did I see them. No Zoom calls, all audio. And the reason for that is twofold for me. Number one is it's a whole lot easier, to do audio only, because I could sit there dressed any way that I want, or not even dressed if I wanted to, and nobody would care. They just want to hear what I had to say. The second part of this is I think we're so visually overstimulated that you got to see everything. And when you start seeing everything, you may not hear everything. So I was mandated that we're just going to do audio only, and they were fine with that. And the shows got better and better and better and better. They're both professionals, both highly educated, both well-spoken, spoke English better than I did most of the time. And I just got very connected to these two. And it lasted a year, and some of the inroads we made were just fantastic. When you start learning about another culture that you only hear about through a headline somewhere, it's a dramatic shift. They always talk about travel being the death of racism and prejudice. That's been my experience. When you travel to other countries, we were just in Normandy last year, in Germany the year before that, in Paris and France. And when you start spending time with other people, you realize, hey, we're kind of all just the same. What a concept. So then you start going, what is that we're spending all this time on being separate? Why is that happening? So in all of that, the bridge experience, to me, I'm reminded of that today as I'm sitting here, and how much ground I've been able to cover behind a microphone over 30 years, and how much influence, if any, that I've had, even today. I question it. I'm walking into the studio here thinking, I've done this a million friggin' times. And does it really matter what I say? I can't answer that. But I do know for myself that this is kind of like the saving grace for me. This is how I pay rent for the considerable space that I take up on the planet. I need to give something back. I need to be able to kind of dig in a little bit and say, can we just stop the bullshit for 5 minutes, see if we can get people together in the same room, even if you disagree, and find common ground? Because if we can't do that, it's never going to come back. I have people over the last 6 months, especially as this was all ramping up with the presidential race, that were spewing things in my direction I couldn't believe. And I said, listen, we've been great friends over the years, but we part ways here. It's not a political thing for me. It was a morality thing. It was a decency thing, and I needed to take a stand on that. And there are some people that I know voted for the current president that I'm still in touch with because I have high respect how they respect me. If you don't do that, we can't talk. Nobody talks. That's a big part of this. So my job has always been to build bridges, for lack of a better term, and bring people together the best that I can. And in order to do that, we have to figure out ways to find common ground together. I think this station's all about, the Heartland Signal, is how do you find common ground? Because if all you're doing is pointing fingers at somebody else, there's still 4 pointing back at you. And I think in so many ways we absolve ourselves from any responsibility or culpability for the actions that we take, or not. When you just heard Father John talking about from a faith perspective on how he does it. So for him, it's being on the World Council of Religions and coming up with this high-minded stuff that is played out on an international level. I don't have that kind of clout. Today, I'm on a microphone in Chicago and online, of course, around the world. But that's the extent of my reach today. When I did the podcast this morning, my Life 1.2 podcast, it was much of the stuff with Jerry Kramer. But 90% of what I do is about how do we find common ground? How do you live your best life? How do you get out of the shirt that's holding you back? If you can't do that, you can't move forward. If you can't move forward, you can't see the future. You can't see the future, you don't care about it. In my observation, experience, and opinion. So all the life experiences I've had, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I try to bring them to bear and say, these are some of the things that we need to pay attention to. And if you don't learn stuff, you never get any further than you are. And there's a lot of people that don't want to. I get that. The few have always done the work for the many. That's the way it works. I just say, if you say something can't be done, don't get in my way while I'm doing it. Many, many, many years ago, and I had not planned on talking about this because sometimes it just comes up and I push it back down. It comes up, I push it back down. But I'm sitting here as Paul's out trying to figure out why we can't get Governor Whitman on the phone with some time to fill. And I think about the odds of me sitting behind this microphone are zero. Zero. I don't have a background in journalism or broadcasting, and I surely didn't think about growing up that I'd be on the radio. I didn't care about any of that stuff. I cared about playing football and drinking Moosehead beer, apparently, and doing other things that I think that were more in line with my personality. But there were some interventions from people over time that I could not ignore. I mentioned almost 2 hours ago when I started this show that Theodore Roosevelt and how he grew up and his life, for lack of a better term, had a huge influence on mine. The guy's been dead since 1919, 1920, somewhere in there. And yet I walk into my office, there's a picture of Theodore Roosevelt. I go, what do I do today, Mr. President? I mean, I take it that serious. The time that we're here is so short, and we spend so much time majoring in minor things when there's so much major stuff to be handled. Arguing over who said what and who did what to who in this tug of war. And I always say, you want to win the tug of war, put the rope down. Everybody else falls on their you-know-what. But there was one guy, above all the people that I've spent time with over the years, that put this right on my back, and I could not ignore it. I tried to ignore it and say, you know what, I'm not interested. I just want to go watch the Bears game and drink brews and knock people on their butts and play football and do this stuff and go fishing. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But what happens is that when it was put on me, I just couldn't ignore the calling anymore. And as soon as I said yes to one thing, the dominoes started falling in a different direction. And when that happens, I think I got to honor this. And like so many people listening to this show, like him or not, you must know the music of John Denver. And he was a worldwide international superstar for so many years. He died in a plane crash in 1997, but 3 or 4 years before that, almost 5 years before that, I was with him in Boston at the Wang Center at a concert. I flew myself out there on a whim because I knew he was going to be there. Something called me to that. I'm listening to my inner GPS, which is not always easy. I find myself at the Wang Center in Boston with him underneath the stadium, the stager, I should say. And I don't even know why I'm there. And I ask him, how you doing? He goes, why are you here? I said, I don't know. I thought you would know. And he did not know. And as it turned out, I had a bunch of letters in my jacket pocket that kids had written me. I had spoken at a friend of mine's grammar school about some environmental responsibility. This was 1990, 1991, somewhere in there. And he said, did you bring me something? And I remembered these letters, and I don't even know why I gave them to him. And I handed these letters over, and he's looking at these letters like he's reading off the Grammy Awards. And he's getting this big smile on his face. And he looks at me and goes, do you have any idea what you're doing, what you're up to here? I'm like, no, I don't. I don't even know what I'm doing here. And he puts his hand on my right shoulder. I will never forget this as long as I live. He puts his hand on my right shoulder, and he looks at me in the eye, and he says, your voice matters. Your voice matters. And up till the time he said that, no one had ever said that to me. No one had ever asked me that. I didn't know anything about it. It was like the clouds parted. And I thought, what are you talking about? He said, your voice matters, and the coming years will prove me correct. So take these letters and put them in my bag, and I got to get to this PR thing, and I will see you again. So I went and did all that. I fly back to Chicago. I think it's great. About 6 weeks later, I get a phone call from his office saying that Mr. Denver brought these letters to a meeting for the WinStar Foundation. It was a 501c3 that he had out in Aspen, or Snowmass, I should say. And he said, we're going to start introducing some environmental programming into grammar schools based on these letters. Would you give us an idea how you did this? I don't even know how I did it. But this is great, sure. That wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning. A year and a half later, I guess it was 1993 at this point, in the spring of 93, I get a phone call in August of that year asking if I would stand in and speak at the WinStar Choices for the Future Symposium with a worldwide audience in Aspen at the Aspen Music Tent and take the place of Dr. Mae Jemison, who's the first female black astronaut in history. I think, are you out of your mind? That's not like talking to fifth graders. This is a worldwide audience. This is a stage. You're John Denver. What? But of course I said yes. I couldn't say no to that. I ended up on stage talking to this audience, and everything shifted from that. He made good on his claim of making sure I found my voice. So every time I get behind a microphone, every time I get on a stage, which isn't as much as I used to, every time I get in front of somebody, even on a Zoom call, I did a meeting the other day, a spiritual circle thing with Jen Weigel, I go back to these things that I'm not qualified to do, but that really shouldn't make the difference. What the difference is do you have the faith to do them even though you can't see the result? And so much what's going on in our lives today, especially with the government and the environment and all the other ents that are out there, is we can't see beyond it. And our faith erodes, and we feel small, and we feel helpless, and we feel voiceless. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. It is not true. You have to find the place that your voice matters and use it. Social media, in my observation, experience, and opinion, is not the place to complain. Nobody cares. If they did, they'd respond in kind, and they don't. So the backyard fence where everybody goes back to bloviate, speculate, sometimes verbally defecate, has now become Facebook, Instagram, all the rest of that stuff. No connection. Just out in the ether, and stuff is thrown out, observations and ideas, and nothing changes. And it's frustrating, and that will diminish your faith. So when I go to all I do is Facebook. I have Twitter, X? I don't even know what it's called. I don't use it. I think I have an account somewhere. I've used it maybe twice. So when I go to Facebook to tell people I'm on WCPT today, there's something here for them, I leave it at that. I don't argue with people there. What is the point? There isn't any. If you always do what you've always done, you will always get what you've always got. And if you want something different in your life, whether it's personally, professionally, whatever, you have to shift the actions that you take. And so I've been at this a long time, and sitting into the studio, I don't know where Paul's at. He's gone. Maybe he's on a lunch break. He's out of here. They gave me 20 minutes to riff until we figure out if the governor can join us or not. I'm sure we'll figure it out at some point. We have a couple more guests coming up. But I wanted to take this time to remind myself of why I do this, and remind you that there's something that you can do right where you're at. I don't know what it is. Search yourself. Turn on your inner GPS. There's something you can do that's far more constructive than getting on Facebook and complaining, which is just destructive. It comes to nothing. And you got to sit through ads anyway. So I look at all this stuff, and for me, this is what I get a chance to do. I get a chance to get on the radio and talk to thousands of people, not as many as I used to, but the podcast does really well. And I get to say what I want, where I want, about what I think is important over and over again, and hopefully it creates a ripple effect. This is what I've been given to do. Writing books about the subjects, doing things like that. I've done 2 TED Talks. I'm not even qualified to do a TED Talk, but they let me do it twice. So in all of this, these examples, and going off what Father John was talking about before, I run this whole deal that I do on faith. It is never easy, but faith's not supposed to be easy. If it was, the fill in the blank. It would be different, and it's not. And so it's up to us, I think, to get this done and make it work the best that we can. And it's on our backs. There's no cavalry coming. We're the cavalry, folks. In all of this. Don't get distracted by the flashing lights and all the smoke over here and the whole Wizard of Oz thing, the man behind the curtain blowing stuff up and scaring people. I did so many talks based on the Wizard of Oz, which told me everything I need to know about moving forward against things that I think are important and with things that are important. You got Dorothy who's lost. You got the Tin Man who's looking for a hat. You got the Scarecrow who's looking for his brains. And you got the Cowardly Lion who needs courage. Of course, the big joke is they already have all that. They just need a little validation from the wizard. A little medallion over here, a little diploma over here. You're all set. You got the heart hanging outside the Tin Man. And Dorothy had the chance to go home anytime she wanted to. She was distracted by the journey and the Wicked Witch. Don't let them distract you. Find what you're supposed to do and go do it. If you're still upright and breathing, or breathing in general, you can do it if you're laying down or whatever, find a place to put your good to use. And pretty soon you're so involved in that the stuff going on over here doesn't have enough time. You don't have time for it. I bring up veterans issues all the time when I'm in here. And I think there's some challenges coming with the VA. I don't know how they're going to treat it. We'll see how it goes. I use very little of their services, and I'm very glad of the ones that I do have access to, so hopefully that changes. But I can tell you when people complain about an issue, and I'm using the veterans thing as a perfect example, instead of complaining about it, go volunteer there. Go sit and read to somebody who has nobody. If you're worried about the way education's treating our kids, go sit and do the after-school program. Help them to read. Help them do their homework, if you can figure it out. There's just so much we can do that isn't being done. And I think that's a huge gap between what's going on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. No matter who the president is or the vice president or Congress, you have no control over that, but you have a modicum of control over how you respond to these things. That's where the power's at. The power is in the response, not the events. And we get stuck on the events and bloviating, speculating, and throwing opinions on the events. and then we're on to the next one. Father John talked about it. The news cycle rolls this stuff through so fast that our central nervous systems are on fire. It isn't good for us. It's not good. It does not help you get centered and move forward into things that are important. So there's that. Haven't seen my producer for a little while. I just killed about 30 minutes, so that's pretty good for being a 66-year-old fella. I want to just run into this project I was going to bring up with the governor, and hopefully we find her. Apparently she's been trying to call, and something ain't working, and they'll figure it out in the other room. But there he is. Hey, he's back. Good to see you. Lunch was good? Good. You bring me a hot dog? Nice. Okay. We'll go to run to a break. You can fill me, and I'll pick up the rest of this stuff afterwards.
You're looking at the big picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
We are getting close to having Governor Christine Todd Whitman on. I promise. We've been working on it. This technical stuff, you never know how it's going to work out. Next week on Live, local and progressive Joan Esposito talking to Courier newsroom correspondents Cameron Stevenson and Colin Booth. Salon.com's Amanda Marcotte, the Tribune's environmental reporter Michael Hawthorne, ProPublica's Brett Murphy, DePaul journalist in residence Chris Beery, Wisconsin Congressman Mark Pocan, and more. Live, local, and progressive weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. Central on WCPT 820 AM, the Heartland Signal website, and tune in. While we're waiting for the governor, there are some phone calls coming in. We're going to go to Jim on the line. We want to talk about Project 2025. Jim, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi. What's interesting is the Republican Party's embraced this Project 2025. I think they actually have an author in the cabinet who's got his fingerprints on the first document of 2025. But it's one thing to dream about this new proposal, the resolution in 240 years. It's another thing to implement it. Mm-hmm. And what's really disturbing today, they went to expose the FBI people who investigated Trump during the insurrection. And he's pardoned 1,600 criminals, some of them with AR-15s that waited there for 2 days with armor-piercing bullets, ready to kill Nancy Pelosi. And they have the nerve to want these names exposed, apparently to be targets for these 1,600 criminals that had long sentences in jail that were released. Mm-hmm. But that's what we're up against in this insanity.
Right. So it's retaliation politics.
Oh, but it's never been done before.
Correct.
I mean, this is completely new. I mean, this is only a. I don't even know the biggest despot in the history. I can't even think of somebody who would release names and put them in jeopardy of being killed or murdered in the United States of America. It's incredible, just an incredible scene.
What do you think, real quick? What do you think needs to happen for that to change? Do you think any Republicans are going to stand up? What do the Democrats have to do? What do you think? No,
there has to be reason. Reason has no authority. Reason is something that we're endowed with, and reason has to, sooner or later, has to take over the populace. You got to have reason. You can't be reasonable to release names of criminals in the United States of America. It's just not reasonable.
So would you proponent that most of the people in the country are reasonable people or unreasonable? Do you think?
Well, I know that 75 million of them are, if they voted for this guy.
And let me ask you this. Do you think that, as we've seen some of this play out in the news, you're seeing these groups that voted for him, all of a sudden they're not like this was a good idea? Palestinians, you talk about the people that are being deported. That there was one guy I saw yesterday who was at one point was at a rally with a big sign to vote for Trump, and now he's being deported. What do you think is going to have to take place for this other side that voted for him to come to their senses? Anything?
Well, yeah, I can suggest a few things. But number one is just follow the bouncing ball. I mean, this is just unprecedented in the United States history, and the people that voted for him, if they feel that, if they really believe this nonsense that Democrats are Marxist and leftist and whatever the heck that is, I can guarantee you that Trump never read Das Kapital by Marx in the 1850s. I don't think he's ever opened a book at that page, or his voters either. So, in other words, they're being what really has happened was social media elected him the first time. Social media elected Trump the first time. Remember the emails, Hillary's emails. That's all they heard from the Republican voters. And that was absolutely Russian propaganda, which is real cheap to do. You can see what Musk is doing, trying to get our information put on his private emails. He's got 25-year-old kids doing it. Right. So you don't have to be a genius to do any of this stuff. But people, as long as they're being spoon-fed nonsense and they can't discern nonsense from reality, we'll come out of it. Though we'll come out of it because we got the protections of it. We've got the House, we got the Senate, and sooner or later we'll get it back and. We'll have to,
and the pendulum will swing the other way, and then.
Well, they said,
right?
But this isn't a pendulum. This is not a pendulum. This is the most obscene thing that's ever happened in American history. You've got a man who incited a riot, who would not admit to losing the election. Nobody in the history of the United States has ever done that, and nobody. I don't know how he can even vote for anybody like that. It doesn't even make any sense. But anyway, no, I'm not worried about the pendulum. There is no pendulum. There's reality and there's reason, and we'll have to get back to it one way or the other. And anyway, thanks. You have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to line 2. No name there, but I'll take the risk. No?
Not screened yet.
Not screened yet. Could be not good. So we're going to work on this. We're just going to run a little filler here for a second. We got some more technical stuff to do. We'll be right back after this.
As the ongoing debate over climate change continues to heat up, the concept of denial takes on a whole new meaning. The scientific community has a split decision when it comes to the notion that human activity plays a role in the warming of the planet. It's not a 50-50 split decision. It's 97% who agree that the massive buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has to do with our carbon footprints, and 3% who insist that all that is occurring is simply part of the natural cycles of Earth. To be clear, most of the 3%ers are on the payroll of oil and energy companies. The DNA of denial has a slew of talking heads in the media, pounding away at the solid scientific evidence, and companies spend millions to create doubt around climate change. Perhaps if they spent millions to develop green energy sources instead, they would be more profitable in the long run. What a concept. I'm Bill Curtis for Earth Matters.
So we're shuffling the deck back here. That's just the way that it works out. And we are still working on getting the governor of New Jersey, the former governor, I should say. She's not the current. She was the 50th on the show. And it's proving to be really interesting. That's one of the things about having a producer on the other side. I can just yell at him. It's not my fault. Let me just set this up for you a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier, I spent 4 years serving at Coast Guard Air Station Chicago, based at NAS Glenview. And my time there was really, really profound. Let's just put it that way. And in all of that, I had a great respect for the base itself and all the history of the base. Of course, the Air Force and the Marine Corps and the Army guys were behind us, and the Navy, goes without saying. And I was out of there in 1986, and about, I guess, in 1995, the base closed, and that was really the end of it for me. I never thought I'd go back there. Why would I? So as it turns out, because of the internet, one of our guys, Master Chief Phillips, found one of our helicopters sitting in a parking lot in Glenview, right outside of the old base boundaries, and it was at a place called the Glen, which is right where the base used to be. And in all of that, we come to find out there's a small museum there that was doing its best to fill in the blanks and keep a presence there for the artifacts that, I mean, it's like this is the kind of stuff should be in a field museum, and they for years have been maintaining this and doing what they can do to make it work. And so I followed along with all this, and there was a gentleman who unfortunately passed away last year, was the director of the museum, and he and I went back and forth quite a few times about what was going on with this helicopter sitting there that, I've flown in, and other guys I know have flown in, and we, was parked in our hangar and all this kind of stuff. It's like running back into your old car that you had for years and go, oh my gosh, let's do something with this. The more I talk with Bill Marquardt, who passed away, the more I understand the mission of the museum there. And so much so that last Tuesday, I attended a Glenview board meeting. And as I kind of made fun in the beginning, if I'd have known it was 3.5 hours of zoning stuff, I'd have skipped it and come around 10 o'clock at night. But I did sit there for 3.5 hours to talk for 3 minutes about what I thought was important with the base preserving the history of NAS Glenview and all that goes along with it, and to support the people that were doing that. And when I found out I'm going to have a microphone today for a few hours, I reached out to Kirsten, who is director of the museum at this point, and I wanted her to share what's been going on, some of the challenges that they face, and what the future might hold. And Kirsten joins me from Glenview. So, Kirsten, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks so much for having me on the show.
So I heard you speak the other night with such great passion and compassion for the efforts. And in a nutshell here, can you kind of condense this down? You came on board, I think, in 2009. Is that right?
I first became aware of the effort to preserve this history and the need for our community to probably get involved to help out around 2009.
Right.
But I've been on the board of the Hangar One Foundation now for about 6 years.
Okay. And you told me the other night when we spoke, when I called you about doing this show, that there was you met a gentleman who really put you in this direction. There was something that happened with a veteran, and I would ask that you share that again here.
Absolutely. So when I walked into the museum in 2009, I'm from this area, from a town next door, Northbrook, and I grew up right next to the air station. And so I thought, being a local person, I knew a lot about the history. And I went over there with my children, having moved back to Glenview, and went with my children and my father-in-law, who was a former naval officer. He was UDT, so they were the forerunners of the Navy SEALs. And we went over to the museum, and I really didn't expect to be surprised by anything, and walked through, and the history is incredible. The docent who was helping me was a World War II veteran, and we got to the part of the museum which is dedicated to World War II, and there was a picture of 2 aircraft carriers docked at Navy Pier, and he started telling me the history of what Naval Air Station Glenview meant to this country and what it did in World War II. And it was almost like, you can imagine like a comic book car coming to a screeching halt. It was a moment for me where I just said, wait a minute, what happened here? And he told me the story of this incredible contribution that Naval Air Station Glenview made to the defense of this country in World War II, producing over 17,000 carrier pilots, really turning the tide of war in the Pacific. And he also told me his personal story, which was, at the age of 16, he had lied about his age to go serve in the Pacific, which he did, and he ended up serving for 50 years. And then here he was in his 80s, working as a docent to help preserve this history and honor the service of, to your point, not just the naval personnel, but all 5 branches served there. And it was many decades of providing service to this country. And it was just a moment. We all have these moments in our lives where we just feel that there's something we need to do. And I made a promise to him, and I said, I'm going to fight as hard for you as you fought for me. And so that was in 2009. So I've tried to do everything I can think of since then, from writing to elected officials, to organizing online petitions, to organizing a community support effort, joining the board of Hangar One. And we've really, and I have to say, our community has done a tremendous job of showing support for this. I think where we run into difficulty is getting the people in decision-making positions to also make the decisions that help create a permanent tribute museum.
One of the things that was a challenge, and I know that you overcame that, was to have a feasibility study done. The Glenview board asked to have that taken care of, and you guys raised the money to do that. You came up with the study, and from what I understand from Bill and from you, that it fell 1 or 2 votes short of being approved to go the next step.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a couple different municipal bodies here in Glenview that we've spoken to. One is the village itself, the other is the Park District. And so one of the things I did was I wouldn't say I stalked Captain Lovell, but I wrote a letter to Captain Lovell back in 2009.
You're talking about Captain Lovell. James Lovell, yes.
Lovell.
Yes.
And he very graciously wrote back to me, and he said that if the opportunity comes up where the economic situation lends itself to creating a permanent museum and the people of Glenview recognize the importance of it, then there might be an opportunity. And I thought it was wonderful advice. 3 years later, the Glen. So what basically happened was Naval Air Station Glenview, when it was closed down in 1995, it was redeveloped into both a shopping area and housing and public space, and it's 1,200 acres, so it was a very big piece of property. And so the shopping center, though, it is organized around the old tower, and it has struggled, and it went into foreclosure, and it went up for sale. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is the point that Captain Lovell really was talking about. Here's this economic opportunity. We need to draw people to the Glen, to the shopping center, to this area to help support our local businesses. And at the same time, we can honor this history. It's just a win-win-win. And so I went up in front of the village board. I made the plea on behalf. I started an online petition, and I was, because there was additional land that was going for sale at that time, and I was voted down. But it did allow me to start a conversation with the village, and they suggested I reached out to the Park District. So I reached out to the Park District, and over a period of 7 years, we tried to do everything we could.
7 years.
From about 2013 to 2020, basically the Park District said, if you want to do this, you need to do some things. You need to show that there is interest in this history, that the community supports it, that there's demand for the programming. And so we did events. We had Flight Fest, which was an incredible activity that we had in the middle of Glen. 7,000. There were 3 of them. 7,000 people came to each one of them.
Wow.
We had it was incredible. The high school kids, they produced GBS. Glenbrook South has a wonderful radio and broadcast department. They made a documentary about it. We had grade school kids going to our junior flight academy. We had local homeowners association do a 4th of July float that said preserve our legacy. And yes, and then we fundraised the money for this feasibility study for a permanent location. So that was about a 7-year process. And yes, it was eventually voted down by the Park District. So that was where we were in 2020. And since then, we've been trying to find another path forward. And as you mentioned, last year we lost Bill, who had served as president for 20 years. But basically what we find is that we're in a situation where after 30 years, so Hangar One Foundation has been around for 30 years since the air station was closed. But our active membership is aging. Most of the people who are involved in it are between 70 and 90 years old. We are in a location that is, we're in basically the back of an aging warehouse. And we are at a point where we don't have the long-term availability of our space, visibility, or historical relevance to allow the museum to stay open and to develop the next generation of volunteers. So the urgent situation that we find ourselves in is needing to relocate in a way that creates that next chapter. And I think one of the main messages that we've tried to share, and what I tried to share on Tuesday night when we were at the village board meeting, is that while it's Hangar One's mission to preserve this history, it's never been our responsibility. We're just a small collection of local residents and veterans who came together to fill the void when no space was set aside for the museum when the 1,200 acres was transferred to the village back in 1995.
And do I recall that those 1,200 acres cost the village of Glenview $10?
That is my understanding. It was a very nominal fee, but at the time, I believe the Glenview announcements put the value of the property at about $280 million.
They should have called me. I'd have given $15. Things would have been a little different. But so you know, I talked to you the other night, and I spoke at the thing on Tuesday night briefly, and I you know, some of the thoughts that I had were like, you know, here we have this rich history of this air station that I served at, and all the other stations was there. The Marine Corps group was there. The Army was there. Of course, you know, the Navy there, the Air Force. Everybody was there, and it worked in conjunction. It was a force, really, in the military. It's a huge slice of history, especially aviation history, for the military in this country. And I just, part of me is like, I don't know how you don't see that. How is this not a like a shining jewel in Glenview that people come up for tourism and they go and, you go to the museum, then you go to the restaurants and hang out and stuff. I mean, I don't know how that's not already in place and how after 30 years you're still struggling. How do you explain that?
And I think what it comes down to is in order to have people act to preserve the history, they have to care about it.
Yeah.
And in order to care about it, you have to know it. And so I think that our current village board has an opportunity, which is that I think in the past, perhaps action wasn't taken because maybe there wasn't a deep understanding of the importance of this history. Mm-hmm. And so that's an opportunity. There's always an opportunity to learn and to not only appreciate what happened before, but to look at what could be in the future. And so, yes, that's why I've always thought that this is a win-win-win. Like, there's no downside here. This is about meeting a promise and it's right there in the mission statement of the Glen Redevelopment Project. It says, redeveloping Glenview Naval Air Station that recalls its rich history. And the thing I always like to tell people is, because people say, well, we did preserve it because there's some parts of Hangar 1, the iconic tower that's there, and some street names. But the thing is, if you stand in front of the tower and you ask people walking by why the two streets on either side of the tower are named Wolverine and Sable, most people don't know. Yeah. And that's the thing, which is the difference between having some images and almost a veneer compared to actually preserving the history. And the other thing I just wanted to share was it's incredibly important. And World War II is probably what happened there in World War II is probably the most famous and widely known component of this for people who are familiar with history. But it is many decades of service. Mm-hmm. And even before the Navy came, Glenview was a cradle of aviation. There was the Curtis Reynolds Wright airfield that was there. Mm-hmm. Really, at the beginning of when aviation, it was just a pioneering time for it. And we had Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh and Wiley Post. Yep. And they were testing high-altitude flight suits. We had in Glenview, the national air races were held there in 2030. The international air races were held in Glenview in conjunction with the Chicago World's Fair in 1933. It's an incredibly deep history that reflects both the 20th century aviation as well as our 20th century defense of this country. And as you know, being a Coast Guard veteran, that, this is where so many search and rescue missions were run. And it's an incredible thing being at the museum and having the honor of serving as a docent at it, which occasionally we have people who volunteer and do that, but occasionally board members fill in with that. And I've been there when people who have been rescued by our helicopter that is right outside that you were talking. Right. And it is incredibly emotional because some of this history relates to everybody in the world, which is, some of that World War II history, but then some of the history is so incredibly personal, and it was clear how emotional this person was coming back and seeing the helicopter and seeing the rescue basket.
I got to tell you something. I was stunned. It's almost like a Twilight Zone, kind of experience. I go there. I don't know how many hours I sat on gate guard duty on the Shermer Road back gate there, and now it's a golf course, right? I mean, so you kind of braille your way through it. And when the first time I saw 1459, it was disturbing, and it was, it was like, so right away we go to how do we fix this? Let's be solution oriented. So in the last few minutes we have here together, what happens next? You guys need to raise some money, need to find a place to park everything. Otherwise, this stuff will be lost to history. I mean, you're in that position now, correct?
We are very much, this is an inflection point for us. We have lost so many active members in the last few years, and we want to be good stewards of the artifacts that we have. We know their importance, and so we say, well, with the human resources and the financial resources we have left, what can we do? And so we have been in conversations with the village in the past year, and where we left it in October was that the village was not in a position where they wanted to make any commitment about a new permanent space, because they said one of the reasons was, well, the only reason they really gave us was because they didn't know what was in our collection. So what we have done now is we've retained an archival firm. We have closed the museum down to the public currently for the next couple months to do a cataloging and inventory project. And at the end of that, that's something that we can share with the village. Mm-hmm. And at that point, a decision is going to need to be made, because what we don't want is to be in a situation where these artifacts aren't properly distributed. If they need to leave Glenview and they need to go to other museums or other collections where they will be appreciated, where they will be shared with the public, where this history will be retained, and that's our mission, is to honor this history and to preserve it. And if it can't happen here, then we need to find somewhere where it will. Okay. And so we want to use whatever time. But our hope is that there's a new chapter. And the fact is that there is a space available under the tower, about 10,000 square feet. And we've indicated to the village that, the village got a lot of money when it sold this land to developers. That's gone into a permanent fund. And what we'd like to see is simply reversing that transaction a little bit, taking a little bit of the cash, mm-hmm. purchasing back that space, and preserving it as civic space, which is arguably perhaps what it should have been in the first place, and letting the museum relocate there. And that would give it that mm-hmm. historical relevance, that visibility, and that ability to inspire the next generation of volunteers, because we're an all-volunteer organization. We get no money from the village. We survive only on donations. And, that's something where having a space that was more appropriate to honor and present this history, mm-hmm. We need to be somewhere where that works long term.
So let me ask this, and I'm going to let you go. So if somebody out there wants to write a really big check and save the day, how do they find you? What's the best way to do that?
We have a website, thehangar1.org, and that is somewhere where they can reach out to us through the website. Okay. And that's probably the best way to do it. But yeah, if there is somebody out there who would like to be an angel donor and help us relocate under the tower, that would be a wonderful thing.
I'll tell you what, if I win the lottery tonight, I will do that, and I will name, on one condition, that we name the museum after my lieutenant who passed away, Lieutenant Muncie. We call it the Lieutenant Rusty Muncie Museum. Would that work if I get $5 million together?
Deal?
Done. All right.
Deal.
Kirsten, thanks so much. I got to let you go. We're running short on time, but I appreciate everything you're doing, and we'll be in touch soon, okay?
Thank you so much. Take care.
All right. Going right to the governor, because we've been waiting, and we've had some technical issues back and forth. Governor Whitman, welcome to Chicago.
Oh, well, it's always good to be there, except probably not right now. I'm in Arizona, where it's not snowing, it's not raining, it's not cold.
Yeah, you stay right there. You just stay right there. It's a little chilly here. I apologize for all the technical stuff, and I know you're short on time, but, I reached out to your office because you and I have had conversations over the years going all the way back to when I was at Harpo and all that stuff. And one of the things that was always intriguing to me is that you've always believed environmental and economic goals go hand in hand, and we are not in that time anymore. And I wanted to give you the time to kind of make that pitch and see if we can glean some insight from where we're at now and how do we get past all this.
Well, I mean, it's going to be difficult because clearly there's an administration right now being put in place that is not terribly interested in environmental issues and, in fact, looks on the Environmental Protection Agency as a big block to economic development. And the thing we have to remember is, first of all, if you look at the history, this idea that you cannot have a healthy and green environment and a thriving economy together is just wrong, because when you invest in clean technology, you're creating jobs. You're getting more people there and coming up with new ideas, plus the fact that it makes us healthier. Clean air to breathe, clean water to drink is something we all need. And if we haven't learned from this past year of the increased frequency and severity of storms, the fires that in California, the droughts that we've seen, that Mother Nature is really stressed. And you have to think, okay, yes, climate change has been happening since the Earth was formed, but not at this level, not at this constant increase. Each year is warmer than the year before. We are stressing. the climate. And so we need to take some steps, and that comes with an environmental balance. We want to keep a thriving economy. We need to have that to invest in the new technologies that will help clean the environment. Yeah. And so these things feed on one another.
When you were the EPA administrator back in 2001 under President Bush, and obviously prior to that you were the 50th governor of New Jersey, this has always been a mandate for you. And I guess I find it fascinating that people think that a Republican would talk this way. But this is how it used to be.
Well, yes. I mean, remember, it was Richard Nixon who started the Environmental Protection Agency and signed the Clean Drinking Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. I mean, this is environment. Well, you know, Abraham Lincoln established the first national park in Yosemite. This has been, conservation is conservative. And if you believe that we were given a responsibility to take care of this earth, then it's also something that those who are very concerned about the religion that we're seeing today, this is a very, very conservative thing. It is conservation. It doesn't mean stopping and blocking everything. It means being sensible. And the thing people have to remember is Mother Nature, and, you know, I've said it to you before, Mother Nature doesn't observe geopolitical boundaries. And when I was governor, I could have closed down every industry in the state of New Jersey, and I still would have had trouble meeting the clean air standards because of air transport, the dirty air coming from the coal mines, the coal mining that was going on in West Virginia and Kentucky. So it migrates. We know that. We've been through, when we've had the big fires in the West, it impacted New York last summer. I mean, you smelled the smoke from Canada. It's something that we have to understand, that you cannot just leave it to the states because the pollution migrates. Right. And we all want our children to be healthy. We all want all of us to be healthy and have clean drinking water. So we need to take this seriously. And what I'm concerned about with what I see happening now is this idea that sort of all regulations are bad. I'm a firm believer that regulation should be reassessed at a minimum every 10 years, probably every 5. But that's a big job to do because we learn so much. I mean, then there may be some regulations we don't need anymore. We may have phased out that particular product. Or we may have found some other things that are more problematic than we thought, like plastics and plastics in the brain, plastics in the body, killing our sea life. You know, we learn, and you want to learn, and you want to be flexible enough to be able to change with that learning. But it's got to be based on science. It can't be on politics. It's got to be on science. That's a tough sell these days, Governor. I know, but, you know, I think the people eventually are going to start to say, no, wait a minute, this has gone a little too far. We were not happy with where things were, but this is going too far, and that's my hope. So, and it's also, go ahead. If you get people in all, it's just we are doing at the Forward Party is getting people into office who want to solve problems. And we're not saying they have to take care or believe in climate change. We don't take those kinds of positions, but they're sensible people who will look at the issue from the perspective of what's good for my community and for my state. Just curious, do the present-day Republicans who, and when I was kind of promoting this a little bit in our show, you know, don't resemble any of the Republicans I remember growing up, nor myself as a Republican at a time. And I think if you're a Republican back in the 80s, now you're a Democrat. I mean, that's how it kind of lines up now. But do any of the present-day Republicans ever reach out to you and say, what do you think about this, Governor? Not much. I didn't think so. Those who say they're a Republican, I honestly don't think there's a Republican Party anymore. There's a cult of Trump, but not a political party in the sense, a Republican Party in the sense it was before. You're right. It is totally different than when you grew up and when I grew up. And back in those days, problems did get solved because everything wasn't analyzed through the partisan political prism. It was analyzed through the policy prism. What'll solve this problem? Now everyone's so afraid of losing their position that they don't want to do anything that might jeopardize that, and that means you don't take a position on anything.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier, and then we'll cut you loose. I know you're short on time, and I appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday. I mentioned earlier about the Montreal Protocol and how difficult it was to get everybody on board, especially President Reagan, until Maggie Thatcher, who was a scientist and a chemist, said, look, here's the deal. And if we don't do something about the ozone, the incidences of skin cancer are going to rise. And President Reagan had some bouts with skin cancer, so all of a sudden it was something in his back pocket, something he can connect to. I think one of the great challenges is when we hear this stuff, oh, that's happening over there, or that's in Antarctica, or that's in South Africa or something. But yet here in our own country, Los Angeles almost burned to the ground. So it is in our backyard.
It's no longer over there. It's happening everywhere. I mean, look at this winter storm that's taking the West. Look at the tornadoes that we had yesterday. People are losing their lives, their homes, their livelihoods. It's costing, from an economic point of view, if you're a fiscal conservative, it costs billions of dollars to recover from these storms. So it doesn't make sense to ignore the message we're getting from nature saying we need to take some steps to be protected.
Last question. What do you do with yourself these days now that you're out of office? How do you stay involved in the way things are going with your Whitman group and the other things? How do you still pay the rent for the space you take up, Governor?
Well, as I mentioned, the Forward Party, Andrew Yang, who ran for president as a Democrat and then for mayor of New York, and I are co-founders of something called the Forward Party. It's a state and focused on state and local, but we're really gearing up for the congressional races in 2 years. And the candidates that we support, they can be Republican, Democrat, Independent, as long as they will sign a pledge. And the pledge is that they agree to uphold the rule of law, respect the Constitution, work with anyone to solve problems, create a safe place to discuss controversial issues, and ensure that anyone who is legally able to vote can vote. And then we have 3 pillars of what we want to accomplish, which is to give people dynamism, to give them the opportunity to succeed by ensuring their education and their opportunity for economic growth, defend our Constitution. And those are the things that we are focused on. And that's it, not on you have to be pro-gun or anti-gun, you have to be pro-life or anti-life. We want people to have the freedom, these candidates to have freedom to represent their districts and their states and what they believe in, not being told by a party, no, you have to have this position or that position.
Governor, I appreciate you taking time. I know it's short. Once again, always, every time we talk, even though it's like 18 years in between time, but every time I talk with you, I'm always learning and being reminded of something. So I appreciate all the effort and energy you put in service to our country and especially the environmental stuff. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you. I always enjoy talking with you, and thank you for taking on the serious issues.
I'm just warming up. I'm just warming up after 30 years. Right. So, all right. Thanks very much. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Take care.
All right. Yep. We're going to jump over to Steve and go back to this NAS Glenview thing here real quick. Steve, how you doing? Sorry to have you on hold.
Yeah, pretty good. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm good.
Yeah, I was the conversation you had with the lady from the Glenview Air Base.
Yep.
Just a quick background. I grew up in Warm Grove. I used to be able to sit on my front porch and watch the airplanes when they had these air shows out there in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And grew up with all that. And I remember the Blue Angels would come in and land on. And we'd sit out there on Willow Road and watch them come in. And I happened to be driving across Willow Road when the Falcon crashed. I was one of the first people. Yeah, amazingly, the timing was kind of somber. But anyway, I wanted to recommend to her, I mean, she's having problems with all that. She should contact, if you can still get a word to her, and I'll try maybe the Experimental Aircraft Association up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. They're the ones that have the big air show, the flying. Those are the ones that, and they have a subgroup amongst them, the Warbird Division. They're the people that they have the manpower, the know-how, the group of veterans. They could be a powerhouse, maybe, if not, if you can't get the stuff in the Glenview space, which is ridiculous when you think about it.
Yes, it is.
That's a shame. I mean, that's a travesty. Maybe they can put it in the museum up there somewhere. And now the air show is coming up in July. The biggest aviation air show in the world for 7 days.
Yeah, it's a thing.
it is a thing. It's a definite thing. I've been going up there for 30 years.
Yeah.
If she was to maybe have a seminar up there, because she could maybe put in to do a forum and get her word out. So these are all avenues. And there would be no other better organization than EAA for her to network with.
I think what's happening, you probably heard in the conversation, they've been at this a long time. They've been kind of head in the direction they think they need to go with the Glenview Park District and the village, because that's would make the most sense. And after 30 years, as she mentioned, I mentioned, Mr. Marquardt passed away. He was in charge of this for a long time. They kind of went by the wayside. A lot of the people that are volunteers are in their 80s and 90s. These are old veterans from back in the day, and they're kind of worn down to the point where they don't know what else to do. So that's why I thought having this conversation was important, and I appreciate you with your suggestions. I will make sure that I pass that along, so I appreciate it. And I got to tell you real quick, Steve, I was in 2 air shows when I was at Seagas Chicago, Air Station Chicago, and 1459, we go out over the lake, and then you have to rescue a guy. So I'd be the victim, right? I'd have to jump out of the helicopter like 12 feet up. Yeah. And the lake's a lot colder about a mile out than it is on shore, I'm here to tell you.
Well, it's easy. I was in the Marine Corps, and
thanks for your service.
I spent a year in Iwakuni, Japan with the 1st Marine Air Wing, and that's where I first started taking flying lessons.
Okay.
I got a flying club, back in the day. I mean, this is the 73, right at the end of Vietnam.
Yeah.
So I'm one of the older vets, but like I said, the World War II guys are shrieking away.
And I think it was Marine Corps 60 was at, maybe 60 was at Glenview. I can't remember.
Good, I don't remember that far back with all that stuff. But anyway, if you can get her in touch, that would be a phenomenal networking for her, I think, to go up to the air show and whatever. So
definitely.
Anyway.
Well, I appreciate the call, Steve. Thanks for listening.
All right, buddy. Take care.
We're going to jump to a short timeout and start getting to my last piece of this. We're about 15 minutes to go. A lot of moving parts, kids. Hold on to your lug nuts. Still time for an overall. Back after this.
Picture is on now. WCPT 820.
Big Picture's on, but I am not Edwin, as you can tell, for the last 3 hours or so. I'm John St. Augustine. I've been sitting in since 1 o'clock, and I got about 14 minutes to go before I can start going put on the feed bag at LaVilla Restaurant, which is right down the street. We're waiting to get my friend Christine on, who is the owner of LaVilla. And the reason I asked around was a couple of reasons. One is it is a 50-year-old business owned and operated by the same family since 1972. Nixon was president. That's a long time. They've gone through a lot of ups and downs over the years. And that's one part of it. The other part of it is they are just been featured on America's Best, this television show. It's also online. You can see it as one of the best restaurants in the country. And I've known her since there was a little pizza drive-in window in the 70s. Her dad was like the resident hero, because if he had extra dough left over, he might make a little pizza here, a little something over there. You go in get in line, and Mr. C would dole out some extras and stuff. So I talked to her about 15 minutes ago. They're really busy over there. We're hoping we can get her to cut loose for a few minutes. If not, I will just promote it, and then I'll be heading out the door either way, whether she joins me or not. So in all of this, I want to make one more pitch about this thing with the NAS Glenview Air Museum. Let me just say that I'm not here to say who's wrong or right in all this, because I don't know anybody on the Glenview board. I spoke to these people for 3 minutes, but I will say that the next morning I sent a thank you email to Mr. Jenny, who is the president of the board, and he responded right away, and he said, thanks so much for taking the time to come out. I kind of busted on him saying I sat here for 3 hours to talk for 3 minutes, but as a veteran myself, and as someone who I look at it in many ways, one of our general orders is you don't leave your post until you're properly relieved. And in some ways, I've never left my post. And there's guys that could speak to this that I served with far better than I can, pilots and warrant officers and guys with a lot of, rash and slash on their sleeve. But for me, there's something about that keeps drawing me back to that time in my life. Maybe it's just because I was a young guy and starting out, but there was something about the impact of being in the Coast Guard, especially the aviation wing, that just stuck with me. And it was a fascinating experience. So I have a very personal, I guess, regard for what's going on out there. And, so the best of all worlds would be to figure out a way to have that museum put in Glenview. And, the people from the Midwest go to this place and visit it, like I did when I was in Normandy last year. Go to these military museums are a big deal. And 1459, this helo that served admirably for years, as I mentioned, there were 99 of these HH-52As built. There are 16 that we know of on displays in museums around the country. Most of them are in boneyards somewhere, but 1459 still sits with potential in the parking lot of this little NAS Glenview Museum that they've been holding together with spit and plastic and, tape for 30 years. It just should be different than that. From the outset in, that's how I see it, of course. And I don't know anything about their bylaws and all the rest of that stuff. All I know is a veteran who spent time there, a formidable time in my life, and these old vets that I talked to on the way out the door. This means a hell of a lot to us, and it should be that way. Our history is getting erased in so many different ways. This should not be part of that. So when Mr. Jennings sent me this email the next morning, he reminded me that before I left, he made mention that someone very close to him and his family had served in the Navy, I believe, for many years, and that had passed away from the effects of Agent Orange, and how much that impacted him and how much of an impact this gentleman had in his life. So he gets it. Now, how much else has to happen for that to take place? I don't know. Can they get some help from the Oshkosh B'gosh group up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin? I don't know. But what I do know is they're up against it. They got to find a place. They're on a month-to-month lease at a very small space. It's amazing what they've pulled off. It's like going into like a condensed version of what happened at NAS Glenview for decades. It is history, living history. They have stuff in there that you won't find anywhere else in the world. So as passionate as I am about the environmental stuff that I talk about, I'm just as passionate about veterans issues. And to me, this is a veterans issue. We served there. We flew there. I held gate guard duty on Shermer Road for too many nights, and all the rest that goes along with it. And that has great value to me. And you think of the thousands of men and women that served there over the decades, that their memory should not be pushed off to the side because somebody can't figure out how to do it. I'm a solution-oriented guy. My first thought was, and I wasn't kidding, I always play the lottery. You never know what's going to happen. If the money comes rolling in, I got some extra cash, I'll give him the $5 million. We'll name it after Lieutenant Rusty Muncie, who was my lieutenant and a guy that I missed terribly. I'll do it. No problem. But in lieu of that, there's got to be a way to fix this. That's how I see it. There's no way that this goes on for 30 years and these folks who have held this thing together on a promise should be left out in the cold, that this should just go by the wayside. It should just be gone. I don't get that. This is probably the reason I don't sit on boards. I'm too solution-oriented. I'd be like, all right, how do we do this? Let's get it done. We got room. Let's do it. We don't need a $50 million place to put it. We need about $2 to $5 million to do it right. And then what you do is you get school kids to work there, and you make it interactive, and you get some old vets to volunteer there, and then you start promoting it. Pretty soon people are coming from all over to see what happened at NAS Glenview, and that brings businesses back to a paying basis. People want to go have lunch. They want to do this. These are all common sense things to me. This is what I do, folks. This is how my brain works. I'll be looking at the news and go, well, here's the answer to that. How do we do it? Here's the answer to this. Here's how do we do it. These are commonsensical things to me, but we live in very uncommon times. So sometimes it's hard to make ends meet with this stuff. I don't think Christine's going to make it. We've tried her a few times. I only got 8 minutes to go. So let me just tell you this. LaVilla Restaurant at Pawlikowski and Addison, right there, has been there since 1972. And every year for the last 10 years, my alumni, Schurz High School, I'm an alumni member there, part of a volunteer group. We've held our Bulldog Bash there every year, and we pack the place, and we raise a bunch of money for Schurz High School, and Christine goes above and beyond the call of duty to over-deliver and underprice the thing. And so we're indebted to her for that. But more than that, I'm just a small voice in a sea of voices who have been part of the LaVilla story for decades. And in all of that, I want to support things that matter and have worked for me. And I wanted you to know about this place. If you don't know about LaVilla Restaurant, and they didn't pay me to do this, I might get a free biscuit out of it later when I head over there. Or maybe when I get to the bar and see this world's smartest bartender over there, maybe I'll get a little something that way. But other than that, there's no other hook here except they're doing incredible work there. They've been there for 50 years. 50 years. And they're still cranking it out. And then so when I found out that America's Best will be there and did a feature on them, which I watched online, you can go to LaVilla Restaurant on Facebook. You can go to their website. You got to see the interview with Christine there because they got all this food laid out. And I'm thinking, why didn't they call me? I just sampled it for them. But they got all this food laid out there. And it's just a great testament that they have finally been recognized as one of the best of the best, not just in Chicago, but in the country. That is bragging rights. So when you grow up in a city like Chicago and you know where you're putting your cash out, and somebody that you know personally has this kind of success after the ups and downs of the restaurant business, which is more than difficult, we help them. We, meaning our alumni association and a lot of other devoted customers, we push them right through Cyrus the virus, COVID-19. We pushed them through that. We made a concentrated and concerted effort every Friday to go by takeout. And it kept them going. The restaurant was closed, but we pushed that, because we know who they are. They're our friends and they're our family. And we're treated as such. You know, every time I walk in there, it's the best thing. I get pinched on the cheek. I don't have an Italian bone in my friggin' German, Swedish body. But when I go in there, it's like going into, hey, how you doing? It's like going into the set of The Godfather. You know what I mean? So without all the shooting. So let me just really clear on that. So as I get ready to wrap this up, I just want to say thanks for spending your afternoon with me. I want to thank my friend Paul. It's great to see you again, brother. Always good to work with you. I have some things here that I never got to, but I was able to cover the Moosehead beer thing, talk about what I think is important when it comes to environmental responsibility. My thanks to Governor Whitman, who took time out. I wish we could have had a little bit more time with her, but she always brings it home. And I'm encouraged when I talk to people like her. She's pushing 80, by the way. Don't tell her I said that, but she is. And she'll be 80 years old this summer, but she's still working at it. And I think that's what you do when you find a cause bigger than yourself. You put yourself into it actually. You don't just slough it off onto a politician somewhere. You take action where you are to do what you got to do. All week, after I posted that I'm going to be on the show here hosting this afternoon and put it on our Coast Guard alumni page, for lack of a better term, the Coast Guard Air Station page, everybody's thanking me. I'm thinking, listen, man, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. I mean, I signed up for this in 1980. I just think the mission changes over time and you adapt with it. So I love working on the reunion stuff with the guys. Last summer, to the great credit of the Glenview Park District, we had a bench put in that is basically overlooking the same area where our hangar used to be. Now it's just a tee box for the first tee. And there's a marker there for an incident that happened in 1977 where a Coast Guard Air Station Chicago crew was lost and all on board were perished. And that was put in. And the Glenview Park District paid for all that. We didn't ask them to do it. We're ready to open our checkbooks and sign the checks and put some cash their way, and we didn't have to do that. So if we can do it on that level, maybe somebody's listening out there that goes, here's an idea, like Steve had some ideas, and maybe we can push this thing through. I just get to the point in my life and my career, whatever this is, left of my broadcasting career, that I want to use this microphone to move people to action the best I can and stop with the bullshit about who's right about it. Life's too short for that. If you're lucky, you're going to get about 28,000 days to be alive. How you spend that time is really up to you. I just prefer to spend my time on doing things I think that can make a difference. And part of this is this history of this base. I wish I could had a picture that I could show you online, obviously, not here because we don't have the camera on today. One of my favorite things was at night when I had the duty. And I would climb up this little skinny ladder to the roof of our hangar, to the flat roof on each side, then go up to the big roof on top. And I could see the entire 1,200 acres of NAS Glenview. And off to one side, there were housing, for families and the brass and all that stuff. And way on the far other side was a golf course. But most of it was concrete runways. And all those little blue runway lights were on. Try and say that 3 times after 4 hours. Those blue runway lights were on. To this day, that's what I see when I go there. It had that much of an impact on me. And sit and watch the P3s come in, or the Army guys come in, or even our own Coast Guard guys come in off a mission or off a training flight, whatever it was. It just all was so formative to me. That's why veterans feel the way that we do about these things, folks. We signed a paper that said this is what we're going to do. If you're a member of the DD 214 Club, that is the Honorable Discharge Club, then you understand what I'm getting at here. The mission continues. There are things we can do. So hopefully maybe somebody out there heard this. Maybe they get a hold of the Hangar One Foundation, talk to Kirsten and say, hey, here's an idea as well. So we'll see where all that goes. Anyway, I got to get out of here. There's more stuff coming up. It's been great to be with you. A huge honor for me, really, after all these years, to be asked to sit in and have a microphone right here on WCPT. Until next time, be well, safe travels, take care of yourselves, and no matter what, keep the faith.